Hey guys, tonight we step into Sumerian tablets like you're stepping into a room where the air feels older than the road beneath your feet and every small sound carries as if it has been travelling for thousands of years. You can almost hear the soft scrape of reed on clay, the faint tap of a stylus, the quiet patience of someone trying to make a moment last longer than a breath. And we're going to keep things gentle and honest as we go. Some of what you'll hear is widely accepted history, the kind scholars can point to in artifacts and timelines. Some of it is interpretation, the careful guesswork people make when the evidence is incomplete. And some of it is the soft cinematic what if, not to sell you a fantasy as fact, but to explore why this mystery still tugs at the human mind. And yes, you probably won't survive this journey with your modern attention span intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments, and let's make this a quiet global campfire. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a place that feels like a held breath. It's not a temple, at least not in the dramatic movie sense. There are no torches throwing heroic shadows across columns. No chanting that cues you to feel important. It's closer to a modern archive if the modern archive were built from sun-baked brick and smelled faintly of dust, reed fibre, and something mineral like dried riverbed after a long heat. The lamps are small. The light is warm and low. The world is quiet in that way quiet rooms get when everything inside them is meant to last. And they're laid out like sleeping animals on a table are the tablets. They are smaller than your imagination wants them to be. Your mind expects something epic like a stone slab you need two strong assistants to carry. But many of these are palm-sized, some no bigger than a thick coaster, some shaped like a little pillow, some curved as if the clay remembered the hand that held it. They are not glamorous, they are practical. They are what you make when your world runs on mud and water and you need to store a thought without paper. Archaeology suggests that these tablets were written and stored in temples, palaces and administrative buildings, in places where people managed grain labour, livestock, debts, offerings, and the endless small tasks that make a city possible. That's the solid ground. That's the part of the story where most historians agree Sumer was among the earliest places where writing became a regular tool, and clay tablets became the everyday hardware of record keeping. But tonight, you're not here to count barley. You're here to listen, because as you sit with these tablets, as you let your eyes move over the neat wedge marks, you start noticing something that feels less like accounting and more like a voice, a rhythm, a repetition that resembles memory, the way you remember your own life in little patterns, not as a perfect film, but as highlights and fragments. You remember the smell of rain on hot pavement. You remember one sentence someone said that hurt more than it should have. You remember your mother's hands, but not the exact date you learnt to tie your shoes. And you begin to wonder, softly, carefully, without declaring anything like proof, what if some of these tablets were not trying to be myth in the way we usually think of myth? What if they were something closer to records of memory, the way people preserve what mattered when they didn't have cameras or journals or a cloud account that loses your password right when you need it most? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You pick up a tablet, or at least you pretend you can. In reality, you'd be wearing gloves and a professional would be giving you a look that says, please don't treat a 4,000-year-old artifact like a snack, but in your mind you lift it. It's heavier than it looks, dense with clay. The marks are small, pressed in with a stylus made of reed, a simple tool that could turn wet earth into language. That alone is enough to make you pause. Because the invention isn't just writing, the invention is time travel in slow motion. What's broadly accepted is that early writing in Mesopotamia began with practical needs, tracking goods, assigning rations, listing deliveries. But even within that practical world, people didn't stop being human. You can write down the number of sheep, yes, but you can also write down the feeling of being hungry. You can list the offerings for a festival, yes, but you can also record the story. That festival tells, the one that explains why the river rises, why the crops fail, why the king sits on his throne and insists this is all normal. And this is where the air changes, because there's a difference between an administrative tablet and a literary one. There are hymns, myths, epics, proverbs, laments. There are texts that sound like voices speaking across a gap so large your brain tries to refuse it. If you've ever read a line that feels weirdly modern, like, wow, people were stressed back then too, you know what I mean. You realise the past is not a silent movie. It's a room with people in it. One interpretation is that when we call something a myth, we sometimes make it smaller than it is. We hear myth and we picture a fantasy, a made-up tale meant to entertain or control. But myth can also be a container, a vessel, a way to hold something too big, too painful, too complex to write as a plain statement. If you tell your child the river flooded because the clouds were heavy, that's true, but it's thin. If you tell your child the river flooded because the gods argued and the water rose in anger, that is not literally measurable, but it carries emotional weight, it carries warning, it carries memory. It says, this happened. It can happen again. Be ready. And you can feel why a community might keep telling that story, polishing it like a stone in the palm, passing it down until it becomes smooth and shining and shaped like a god. So what if, in some cases, myth is simply memory-wearing ceremonial clothing? You walk in your mind out of the archive and into the city that made these tablets possible. You're in the south of Mesopotamia, between rivers, in a world of reeds and canals and flat horizons. The sun is bright, the ground is pale, the wind tastes like dust and salt, and everywhere there is mud turned into brick, brick turned into walls, walls turned into neighbourhoods. You can hear the city, not the romantic city of postcards, but the real one. Donkeys, feet, children, vendors, water sloshing in jars. The sound of a reed basket being set down. Somewhere someone is yelling about a missing goat like it's the end of civilization, which, to be fair, might be true if that goat is your entire livelihood. This is where writing becomes more than a tool. It becomes a habit, a culture, a new way of remembering. Archaeology suggests that scribes trained in schools learning to copy signs again and again. That repetitive practice matters because repetition is not just education, it's a memory machine. You say it again, you make it stick. You write it again, you make it survive. And when you think of myths being repeated, sung, performed, copied, you start seeing the same mechanism. Not necessarily deception, but preservation. A careful reading might suggest that some Sumerian stories feel like they are trying to hold on to real experiences, but in the language available to them. The language of gods and monsters. The language of cosmic drama. The language that makes daily life feel meaningful when daily life is mostly sweat and uncertainty. You pause near a canal. The water moves slowly, carrying bits of reed reflecting the sky in a lazy shimmer. You imagine a person standing here thousands of years ago, watching the same motion. Maybe they are thinking about the river's power, the way it gives life and threatens to take it. Maybe they are thinking about a flood they survived, or a drought that killed their crops. Maybe they are thinking about the king's new project, another canal, another temple, another promise that this time the gods will be satisfied. And then because humans are humans, maybe they're also thinking, great, another construction project. Because nothing says ancient civilization like being forced into public works you didn't vote for. You smile just a little because it's the kind of thought that makes the past feel close. And if you're listening in bed right now, you might be smiling too, that sleepy little smile that says people have always been people, but still the tablets. You return to the lamplight in your mind and you let yourself focus on the core question. What if these texts were not only stories about gods, but also recordings of what it felt like to live in a fragile world? What if the divine characters are a way to talk about forces that had no other name? The river's mood, the king's authority, the terror of famine, the luck of a good harvest, the constant awareness that tomorrow is not guaranteed. This is suggestive, not conclusive. We can't confirm the inner intentions of a scribe who died millennia ago. We can't interview the person who listened to the story at a festival and cried quietly into their sleeve. We can't run a neat experiment and label a tablet as memory or myth, the way you label folders on your computer. But we can notice patterns. We can notice that stories often preserve the things a society cannot afford to forget. We can notice that when communities face floods, droughts, invasions, and political upheaval, they don't just record numbers. They record meaning. They ask why. They assign narrative to chaos. And if you've ever been in your own chaotic season of life, you know that instinct. You know the mind wants a story, even a flawed one, especially a flawed one, because a story is a raft. It doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to float. Historians still argue whether many of these Sumerian literary texts should be read primarily as religious theology, political propaganda, entertainment, moral instruction, or something closer to cultural memory. And the honest answer is probably a bit of all of it, depending on the text, the time, the audience, and the purpose. So tonight we're going to do something gentle. We're going to treat these tablets like a room full of voices. We're going to keep the solid ground separate from the mist. We'll walk on what is widely accepted, we'll step carefully into interpretation, And when we drift into what if we'll do it openly as imagination, as mood, as a way to feel the past rather than to claim we have solved it. You don't need certainty to be moved. You just need to listen. And as you lean in closer to the first tablet in this long, quiet journey, you realize the real surprise is not that the ancient world wrote myths. The surprise is that the ancient world wrote anything at all, and that it survived long enough to reach you here now in the gentle light of your screen, while the modern world hums outside your room like distant wind. You stay close to that lamplight, feeling the quiet warmth behind your eyes, and you let the tablet world pull you a little deeper, not with a dramatic shove, but with the slow, steady gravity of repetition. Because once you accept that clay can hold a voice, the next question is almost unavoidable. How do you teach mud to speak? You move into a different room now, still in your mind, but it feels less like an archive and more like a classroom. The air is thicker here. There is more breath in it, more bodies, more impatience. The light is harsher because learning rarely feels as romantic as remembering. A few windows cut rectangles into the dust. Someone coughs. Someone sighs with the kind of theatrical exhaustion that says, "I've been alive for 12 years and I've seen enough, thank you." Most historians agree that scribes trained through formal instruction, often in what scholars call scribal schools, where students learned cuneiform by copying sign lists, practicing basic exercises, and repeating standard texts until the marks became muscle memory. You can picture it. You can feel it in your own hands. The way writing is not just thought, but pressure and angle and rhythm, the way a single wedge can be neat or sloppy, depending on how tired you are, how hungry you are, how badly you want to be outside doing anything else. You sit at a low bench. The clay is cool and slightly damp. Someone passes you a stylus, a cut reed simple and sharp. It looks harmless, like the kind of thing you would absent-mindedly chew while thinking. But then you press it into the clay and realize it is a tool that demands respect. There is no smooth flowing ink here, no graceful swoop. Every mark is a decision. Every mark is a tiny physical event. Press, lift, turn. Press, lift, turn. Your wrists start complaining in about 3 minutes, which is impressive because your wrists have never met a gym they liked. You begin copying signs. At first you do not understand them. They are little wedges, little triangles, little angled strokes. They look like a code, and that is exactly what they are. A system you have to inhabit. A new way of seeing language. A way of breaking sound and meaning into shapes you can carry. Archaeology suggests that many early tablets were formed for practicality. Some were left to dry in the sun, some were baked harder when they needed to last. That means the tablet in front of you might once have been as soft as dough, then hardened into permanence. It is a strange feeling realizing that the past is not just old, it was once wet. One interpretation is that scribal training does more than teach writing. It decides what a society remembers. Because if you train a whole class of future record keepers on certain standard texts, certain lists, certain ways of describing the world, then those patterns become the default shape of reality. The student does not just learn how to write barley and sheep and 10 jars of oil. The student learns what is worth recording, what counts as knowledge, what belongs in the archive. And if you are a little sleepy right now, your brain might be doing that slow, cozy thing where it connects ancient schoolrooms to your own life. You were trained too in your own way. Trained to remember some dates and forget others. Trained to treat some stories as important and some as background noise. Trained to think the world has certain categories, certain folders, certain labels. Sumer just did it on clay with a stylus under a sun that did not care about your homework. You press another wedge. It goes in crooked. You stare at it. You think maybe no one will notice. Then you remember there is no delete key. There is no gentle little backspace. There is only you, the clay, and the ancient version of a teacher who can absolutely tell you did not practice. You try smoothing the clay and rewriting, but the surface is already scarred. The clay remembers, it keeps the ghost of your mistake. Which is honestly a little rude if you ask me. The tablet is basically saying, I saw what you did, and I will keep receipts for 4,000 years. That physicality matters, because it means writing is not just content. It is craft. It is labour. It is a series of habits drilled into the body, and habits shape memory. A careful reading might suggest that when later tablets feel formulaic, when they repeat certain phrases and patterns, that repetition is not laziness. It is training. It is the sound of schooling echoing across time. You watch other students. Some are quick. Their styluses move like they have already made peace with the rules. Others struggle, and you can tell the struggling students are inventing new ways to be miserable. One is staring into the middle distance, like the clay itself has betrayed him personally. Another is doing that thing where you write fast hoping speed will cover up inaccuracy, which is a bold strategy that never works, but you respect the confidence. And then you hear it. A recitation. Students speak as they write, repeating the signs and words aloud, a steady chant. It is a memory technique you recognize instinctively because your own brain loves rhythm. You learn a phone number by repeating it. You learn a song lyric by hearing it again and again. The Sumerian classroom is doing the same thing, only the stakes are higher. If you fail, you do not just get a bad grade. You might lose access to a career. You might not become the person who gets to sit indoors while other people haul reeds under the sun. There is a small, almost funny truth here. Writing is power, but it is also air conditioning ancient style. You become a scribe, and suddenly your job is not carry heavy things in heat. Your job is sit near a pile of clay and quietly change the world. Historians still argue whether scribal schools were primarily elite institutions limited to a narrow class, or whether literacy spread more widely through apprenticeships and practical training beyond the formal school setting. And that debate matters to our question, because if only a small group controls writing, then memory becomes curated. If writing spreads, memory becomes messier, more human, more unpredictable. You pick up a practice tablet and notice something ordinary that feels oddly intimate. The lines are uneven. The spacing is inconsistent. The student wrote something, then tried to correct it. The tablet feels like a teenager's notebook, except instead of doodling a dragon in the margin, the student is drilling sign forms like their future depends on it. And here comes a quirky tidbit that is widely discussed but still easy to misunderstand. Some students' practice texts and school exercises include humorous proverbs and little sayings, the kind of material that sounds like it belongs in a tired parent's mouth. Things like complaints about work, warnings about laziness, jokes about how life goes when you ignore advice. The past once again refuses to stay solemn. Now there is also a fringe idea. Some people like to float at this point, and we should treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. A popular rumour claims that certain repeated sign patterns in very early texts encode hidden messages like secret memory keys, or even that the classroom tradition was designed to preserve knowledge that was not meant for everyone. This theory is not widely accepted, and the more cautious explanation could be much simpler. Repetition is how humans learn, and standardized texts are how institutions maintain consistency. Still, it is easy to see why the fringe idea persists because it feels cinematic. It feels like a locked door with a whisper behind it. But the solid ground is already fascinating enough, because you realise the classroom is not just teaching writing, it is teaching a world view. Lists matter, categories matter, order matters. If you can list the kinds of trees, the kinds of birds, the kinds of stones, you can manage your environment. You can predict it. You can control it, at least in your mind. And in a world where rivers flood unpredictably and harvests can fail, the idea of control is not just comforting, it is survival. So you copy another list. Signs for animals, signs for tools, signs for professions. The clay absorbs them without judgment, and you begin to feel how a memory can become structured. A memory can become a template. Now imagine this gently as a what if. What if the room itself becomes a kind of sleeping hard drive, not digital, not glowing, but quiet and physical? Every student who learns the same signs, every teacher who repeats the same corrections, every chant spoken over wet clay adds another layer to the same cultural file. Not a file of facts only, but a file of habits, of anxieties, of what counts as real. You can almost hear the echo in the wedge marks. And maybe that is why, when a later tablet tells a story about gods and kings and floods, it sometimes feels less like fiction and more like a memory written in the only language available, the language the school taught, the language the city trusted, the language the hands could produce when the mind was trying to hold on to something fragile. You set down your stylus. Your fingers ache. Your shoulders ache. You suddenly understand why scribes are always depicted sitting. It is not laziness. It is self-preservation. You glance at the tablet you wrote and think, this is not pretty, but it exists. It will dry. It will last longer than you will. And that realization is both comforting and slightly humiliating, because your phone battery will not even last a day, and this lump of mud is out here auditioning for eternity. The evidence we do have points to a world where writing becomes a routine. Routine becomes a memory system, and memory systems shape stories. That does not mean every myth is a literal diary. It does not mean every tablet is a confession. It simply raises the possibility that behind the ceremonial clothing of myth, there is often a familiar human body, a child learning, a teacher correcting, a city organizing itself, a culture deciding what must not be forgotten. And you now carrying that feeling forward, still walking from lamplight to lamplight, letting the clay speak slowly enough that sleep can keep up. You carry that classroom ache forward, the sore fingers, and the faint sense that clay has a longer attention span than you do, and you let the scene widen until the schoolroom walls fall away. Because writing does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a city, in noise, in schedules, in hunger, in people cutting in line, in people pretending they did not cut in line, and in the quiet miracle that anyone, anywhere manages to organise a day at all. Now the archive lamplight fades behind you and you step into Uruk. Not the romantic Uruk from a museum, label neat and calm, but the Uruk that feels like it is constantly moving. The ground is flat and sun-baked. The air tastes like dust and river moisture. The horizon is a pale line. And then the city rises out of that flatness, not with skyscrapers, but with layers of mud brick walls, courtyards, workshops, and the kind of busy energy that makes you instinctively check your pockets, even though you do not have pockets, because you are in a mental time machine and your wallet does not exist yet. Most historians agree that Uruk was among the earliest and largest urban centres in the ancient world, a place where population specialisation and administrative complexity grew fast enough that writing became less of a luxury and more of a necessity. In simple terms, the city gets big and suddenly your memory is not enough. You need a system. You need lists, you need receipts, you need something that can remember what the human brain, busy surviving, will absolutely forget. You walk along a canal where water moves slowly, thick with silt reflecting the sky in a dull shimmer. On either side, people are hauling reeds, stacking bricks, lifting jars, dragging baskets. The sound is everywhere. Footsteps on hard ground. Donkeys complaining like they have been personally wronged by the concept of work. Vendors calling out prices. Children laughing. Someone arguing over a measure of grain as if the fate of civilization depends on it, which to be fair, it might. And you realise something important. A city is a machine that runs on repetition. Every day, the same motions, the same deliveries, the same rations, the same repairs, the same small failures. A jar breaks, a gate sticks, a goat escapes, a worker shows up late and invents a story about a tragic family emergency that definitely happened and is absolutely not just a nap. Now think about what that means for our question. If you live in a city where everything repeats, then record keeping becomes the rhythm of life. A careful reading might suggest that when a society records daily life in a steady, repetitive way, those records can start shaping how the society tells stories about itself. Not because anyone is lying, but because the mind loves patterns. You record the same things again and again, and eventually those things start feeling like the bones of reality. You pass a busy courtyard where an official sits in the shade, a scribe nearby, with a lump of clay. Someone brings in a basket of grain. The official listens, nods, gestures. The scribe presses wedges into clay with that practiced, tired precision that says, I have written grain more times than I have felt joy. There is nothing glamorous about it, and yet this is a mainstream historical fact worth sitting with. Many early tablets preserve administrative records, including ration lists and deliveries, showing how institutions tracked labour and resources. This is one of the clearest windows into daily urban life, because it is boring on purpose. And boring is honest. But boring also accumulates, because what happens when you stack years of boring records together? What happens when you build a city where writing is normal, where clay remembers every transaction, every obligation, every ritual offering? You get a culture that thinks in written forms. One interpretation is that once writing becomes embedded in the city, it quietly changes what a story is. A story stops being only something you tell around a fire. It becomes something you can store, revise, standardize, and distribute. And when you can standardize a story, you can turn it into shared memory. You can make it the official version of what happened, or what should have happened, or what people need to believe happened to keep the city from unravelling. You walk past workshops where people shape clay into bricks, where the same mud becomes walls, jars, tablets. The whole place is mud-based infrastructure. It is almost funny. You live in a world where the building material, the storage medium, and the writing surface are basically the same substance. The city is literally made out of the same stuff it uses to remember. If your brain wants symbolism, Uruk is practically begging you to write a poem about it, which is ironic because you are not allowed to write poems in cuneiform class until you finish your Bali homework. You drift toward a temple precinct. It is larger, more orderly, more controlled. People bring offerings. Officials oversee storage rooms. And here is where the boundary between daily records and sacred story can blur. Because temples are not only religious spaces, they are economic centres, redistribution hubs, places where goods come in and go out. If you manage a temple, you manage memory. You decide what gets recorded, what gets celebrated, what gets repeated each year until it feels like it has always been true. Historians still argue whether Uruk's explosive growth was driven more by environmental advantages and irrigation management, by trade networks, by political organisation, or by the temple institutions that coordinated labour and resources. And you can feel why they argue, because all of those forces overlap in a city like this. The city is a knot. Pull one thread and you tug three others. Now you notice something small and strangely intimate. Cylinder seals. This is a quirky historical tidbit that is both practical and slightly delightful. People in Mesopotamia use carved cylinder seals rolled over wet clay to mark ownership or authorization. Like a signature but make it fashion. Like a stamp but with more artistic ambition. You imagine someone proudly rolling their seal onto a tablet, the way you might sign a document, with a flourish, as if to say, yes, I approve this shipment of barley, and I looked fabulous doing it. And this matters to memory too, because seals turn records into identity. They tie a transaction to a person, a household, an office. They say this happened and someone stood behind it. But in a city, identity is also story. You pass a group of workers receiving rations. Someone gets bread. Someone gets oil. Someone gets beer. Yes, beer. This is not fringe. It is widely discussed as part of daily life. That beer was a common beverage and often appears in ration contexts. And you can feel the modern brain light up at that detail because it is comforting. You think, Civilization. Invent writing, build temples, pay people in beer, honestly a solid plan. Joke one soft and sleepy. If your boss tried paying you in beer today, you would call HR. In Uruk, you would call it Tuesday. Now the city noise continues. It's not just sound, it is information. In a crowded place, you learn quickly which voices matter. You learn the tone of an official, the rhythm of a market pitch, the warning shout when something breaks, the hush that falls when a procession passes. Your brain collects these patterns the way it collects songs. So here is the gentle what if for this section, the one we treat as imagination, not certainty. What if the city itself becomes the narrator? What if the myths and hymns and epics carry the texture of urban life, not as literal transcripts, but as emotional echoes? The argument over grain becomes the argument between gods. The flood that wipes out fields becomes a cosmic judgment. The king's public projects become heroic deeds. The temple's schedules become divine calendars. The city's endless repetition becomes the cadence of sacred text. You pause near a wall, rough mud brick, warm under your fingers. Legends later associate great walls with famous figures, and it is easy for a community to turn construction into heroism. Joke 2. Nothing says legendary king like he funded the city wall. Your modern self hears that and thinks, wow. So even ancient rulers campaigned on infrastructure. But again, this is where interpretation matters. A more cautious explanation could be that stories about kings and walls help a city explain its own survival. Walls are safety. Walls are identity. Walls are the edge of the known world. To say our king built the wall is to say our order is real. Now comes a fringe idea framed safely, because you deserve a little mystery without the illusion of proof. Some alternative history enthusiasts suggest that Uruk's sudden rise and monumental organisation imply outside guidance, as if the city was designed by forces beyond its own people. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have points strongly toward human social organisation, labour, coordination, and gradual development across time. Still, the fringe idea persists because the scale feels astonishing, and humans love an origin story that feels bigger than us. Joke 3 gentle. Whenever humans build something impressive, there is always someone who shows up and says, "Great job, but what if aliens did it?" It is the cosmic version of refusing to compliment your friend's cooking. You keep walking. You notice how the city stores not only grain, but obligations, debts, promises, names, roles. One interpretation is that in a city, memory is bureaucratic. It is externalized. It lives on tablets, in seal impressions, in lists. And once memory is externalized, it can be edited, curated, and ritualized. That is the bridge from daily record to story. Because when you look back from the archive, the tablet does not only remember barley, it remembers what mattered enough to count. And what mattered enough to count often becomes what mattered enough to sing about. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot prove that a scribe heard the market noise and turned it into a hymn. We cannot confirm the emotional intention behind each line. but we can notice that stories born in cities often sound like cities crowded, rhythmic, filled with roles and hierarchies, and the constant awareness that order is fragile. You drift toward evening, the heat softens, shadows lengthen, the canal reflects a darker sky. The city keeps moving, but slower, like it is settling into sleep, the way you are settling into sleep right now. And you feel the strange comfort of it, the idea that even in one of humanity's earliest big cities, people were already trying to do what you are doing tonight. They were trying to make the day make sense. They were trying to store experience. They were trying to turn noise into something that could last. And somewhere in the middle of Uruk's endless motion, a scribe presses a wedge into wet clay, and the city itself seems to lean in as if to whisper, "Remember me." You keep walking through that city feeling, and the noise of Uruk softens into something more structured, like the world is clicking into categories. Names, titles, reigns, years. The kind of information that feels clean on a tablet, even if real life never is. Because sooner or later in a place like this, you run into kings. Not just one king, but the idea of kingship. The idea that someone sits above the chaos and claims they can hold it together. And once a society believes in that idea strongly enough, it wants a list. It wants sequence. It wants continuity. It wants a story that says, we are not drifting. We are ordered. You are holding one of the most famous expressions of that impulse. The Sumerian king list. Most historians agree that the king list is a real ancient text copied in different versions that names cities and rulers and assigns them reign lengths, often dividing time into before and after a great flood. That is solid ground. That is not a rumour. It exists. It is part of how we understand Mesopotamian ideas about authority, legitimacy, and history. But then you look at the numbers. Some reigns are normal enough to be plausible in a broad human way. Decades, reasonable spans, but some are not that. Some are so long they feel like a different species wrote them. Not just a long life, but a reign that stretches across centuries and keeps stretching until you start thinking, okay, either this king had an incredible skincare routine, or we are dealing with something symbolic. You sit with that feeling because this is where the question of memory versus myth gets interesting. A careful reading might suggest that the king list is not trying to fool anyone in the simplistic sense. It might be doing what memory often does, compressing, exaggerating, stylizing, building a bridge across gaps. Think about your own memory. When you tell someone about a difficult year, you do not list every Tuesday. You do not include every boring lunch. You say that year was endless. That is not literally measurable, but it is emotionally true. And if your life had to be recorded for posterity, you might accidentally make your worst month sound like an epoch. Now scale that up to a whole civilization. One interpretation is that those extremely long reign lengths function like memory math, a symbolic way of saying this was a deep past. This was the time of foundations, the time when the world felt larger and less familiar, and the line between human and divine was drawn differently, not because the scribes were careless with arithmetic, but because they were using numbers as meaning. This is where you remind yourself softly that we are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues. You glance again at the structure of the list. It links kingship to specific cities as if to say, power moved. It flowed. It was handed from one place to another. That framing alone is revealing. It suggests a world where political legitimacy is not random, but part of a cosmic or historical order. And in a landscape of competing city-states, that kind of ordering story matters. It is not just about the past. It is about who has the right to rule now. Here comes your first light joke because you deserve one. The king list is basically the ancient version of a verified badge. It is the tablet saying, yes, this city is officially important, and also please do not argue with us about it. You can almost see the political utility. If you can claim your dynasty belongs in the sacred chain of kingship, you have a stronger story than your rival downriver. It is not that different from modern branding, except the logo is cuneiform and the marketing budget is a warehouse of barley. Archaeology suggests that some kings named in Mesopotamian traditions are supported by other evidence, such as inscriptions or administrative records, while others are harder to confirm. That mix matters. It means the king list is not purely fantasy and not purely a modern-style history book either. It sits in the middle, a hybrid text that blends remembered rulers, idealized rulers, legendary rulers, and political messaging. And that blend is exactly what memory looks like when it becomes official. Now the long reigns. You let yourself imagine the scribal mind at work. The scribe is not thinking like you. They are not trying to satisfy a modern fact-checker with a spreadsheet. They are trying to place the past into categories that make sense in their worldview. They may be using number systems and symbolic conventions that feel alien to a modern brain. They may be transmitting older traditions that were already stylized by centuries of retelling. A more cautious explanation could be that these reign lengths reflect symbolic numerology, scribal conventions, or a desire to emphasize the vastness and sacredness of the antediluvian era rather than a literal claim about lifespan. That is a safe and reasonable way to frame it. But you also notice how the list behaves emotionally. It draws a line. Before the flood, reigns are enormous. After the flood, they become shorter and more human. That shape feels like memory, the way the deep past becomes a misty continent, while the recent past feels like your neighbourhood. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm the exact intention behind every number. We cannot interview the person who first recited these names. We cannot reconstruct every stage of transmission from oral tradition to written copy. But we can observe that the list is doing narrative work. It is telling you that something changed, that the world was once different, that time itself used to be measured differently. Whether that difference is theological, symbolic, political, or an echo of real historical disruptions, the text wants you to feel it. Historians still argue whether the Sumerian king list should be treated primarily as a historical chronicle, a piece of political ideology, a religious narrative about cosmic order, or a literary attempt to unify diverse local traditions into one coherent memory. And honestly, the most practical answer might be it does all of those things at once. Now we bring in a quirky tidbit, something small that makes the whole subject feel more human. The king list survives in multiple copies and versions, and not all copies match perfectly. That means scribes copied, adapted, and sometimes reshaped the list over time. In other words, even ancient people had version control problems, except instead of a software update, it was a guy with a reed stylus saying, "I think this range should be longer," and then committing that opinion to clay. Second light joke. Imagine being the intern scribe who accidentally adds a 0, and suddenly your king rules for 800 years. Your supervisor looks at it, nods thoughtfully and says, "Yes, that feels right." Now for the fringe material handled gently. A fringe idea proposes that the long reigns are literal, implying that early rulers were not fully human, or that they belonged to a lost age with different biology, or that the list encodes non-human memory. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence we do have points strongly toward symbolic and ideological functions for these numbers. Still, the fringe idea persists because the numbers are genuinely startling, and human minds love a mystery that feels too big for ordinary explanations. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the interesting part is not whether it is true, but why it appeals. It appeals because it turns the deep past into a stage where anything might have happened, a dreamlike zone where time stretches and ordinary rules feel optional. And that feeling is exactly what memory does to the far edges of your own life too. You try to imagine the world from the perspective of someone hearing this list recited. Names roll out like a chant. City after city, king after king, time stacking. It becomes less like a report and more like a ritual. The list does not just inform, it establishes, it reassures. It says you belong to a chain. You are not alone in time. And that right there is where the memory theory starts to glow. What if the king list is a cultural memory device? What if it is a way to store identity, to compress the past into a recitable spine, to create the sense that history has an architecture? Because in a world where floods erase fields and politics shift fast, the idea of continuity is comforting. If you can say our kingship descends from the dawn, you can sleep at night believing the world is not random. Third light joke, soft and sleepy. You know that feeling when your family tells stories at a reunion and everyone argues about the details, but the point is not accuracy, it is belonging. The king list is basically that, except with more clay and fewer awkward uncles. You set the tablet down in your mind. The lamplight flickers. The wedge marks look like tiny footprints across time, and you feel the strange balance of it. The list is neither pure myth nor pure record. It is a bridge, a way of remembering made sturdy enough to survive. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that when Sumer wrote its kings into clay, it was not only cataloguing power, it was preserving a shared memory of order, loss and continuity, a memory that needed numbers big enough to match how vast the past felt. And you carry that forward one name at a time as the city outside the archive settles into night, and your own room grows quieter, and the idea of ancient time starts to feel less like a distant lecture and more like a slow living dream. You let those king names fade into the warm air of your mind, the way a chant keeps vibrating even after the voices stop. And now you feel the past doing what it always does when it gets too big for ordinary language. It turns toward water, Because when you live between rivers, water is not just scenery, it is mood, it is calendar, it is blessing, threat, highway, boundary, and sometimes a sudden, unstoppable decision made by the world itself. You walk back toward the canals and everything smells faintly of damp reeds and sun-heated mud. The city is quieter now. The day has worked itself tired. The light is angled softer, like the sun is finally willing to speak in a whisper, and you can almost feel why flood stories settle into the bones of this place. Most historians agree that flooding was a real environmental factor in Mesopotamia, and that river systems could be both life-giving and destructive. The Tigris and Euphrates did not behave like polite modern plumbing. They rose, they shifted, they spread. They carried silt that fed fields, and they carried water that could wipe out homes. You cannot build early cities here without learning to fear the river a little. And when a society lives with recurring floods, it remembers them even when it wishes it could forget. This is where the memory theory becomes almost too natural to ignore. A careful reading might suggest that flood narratives are often not a single event in a bottle, but a pattern compressed into a story. The mind does this automatically. You experience many storms, many losses, many close calls, and eventually your brain writes one master story called the flood, even if the reality was a whole series of floods, each with its own shape. One interpretation is that the great flood motif in Mesopotamian literature reflects collective experience with river disasters and the cultural need to explain them. Not only the physical cause, but the meaning, because the river overflowed explains the mechanics, but it does not soothe the heart. It does not answer the deeper question that rises after you rebuild your house for the third time. Why does this keep happening to us? So you watch the water. It moves slowly, but it looks deceptively calm, like a person who has not yet decided to mention the argument they are about to start. The surface reflects the sky, and you can see how easy it would be to trust it on a good day. Then you imagine the bad day: rain upstream, melt water, a surge, the canal banks giving way, the field turning into a shallow sea, the mud brick wall softening, collapsing, dissolving back into the clay it came from. Your brain does not need special effects. It fills in the scene with frightening clarity. Now you step into story space carefully, openly, as a what if. You are not claiming this is a literal transcript of one specific flood. You are letting the emotional truth of floods speak. You are a farmer or a potter or a worker hauling reeds. You have a house, small, practical, built to survive ordinary hardship. You have stored grain, or at least you hope you have. You have a sense of your world, and then one night you hear water where water should not be. You hear it moving wrong, louder, closer. You smell the wetness of it. You wake. You run. You lift what you can. You shout for neighbours. You grab a child, a jar, a blanket, and you leave behind everything else. And in the morning, the landscape is rearranged. Not destroyed completely, because the world rarely gives us clean endings, but altered enough to feel like a different world. Familiar paths vanish, boundaries dissolve. The river has edited your life without asking permission. You can see why a society would turn that feeling into a cosmic story. Because a flood is not only water, it is a sense that the rules can change suddenly. Historians still argue whether specific Mesopotamian flood narratives preserve memory of a single major flood event, regional disasters over centuries, or primarily theological storytelling shaped by later literary traditions. And the honest answer might be that it can be all three at once. A real flood experience provides the emotional fuel, and then storytelling shapes it into a shared narrative. Now we ground ourselves again in the widely accepted. Archaeology suggests that cities used canals, levees, and irrigation systems to manage water, and that water control was central to survival and political power. Whoever organises canal labour and maintains irrigation infrastructure holds influence because they are literally shaping who eats and who starves. Water management is not just engineering, it is governance. First light, joke, gentle. In a river society, the person in charge of canals is basically the ancient equivalent of your internet provider. When it works, nobody thanks you. When it fails, everyone screams like the universe is ending. Now the quirky tidbit. In Mesopotamian literature and ritual, water can be both cleansing and dangerous. And the same culture that fears floods also uses water symbolically in purification. That dual role is very human. We are always making peace with what can hurt us by also using it to heal. You walk along a raised path and see workers patching a canal bank with woven reed mats and clay. It is practical, repetitive work. This is the kind of mainstream detail that makes the past feel real, constant maintenance, the battle against erosion, the weekly repairs, the endless labour to keep water where it belongs. This is not heroic, it is daily, it is survival. And then you hear somewhere a story being told, not in a book, but aloud. A voice that rises over the sound of work, over the slap of mud, over the creak of baskets. The story says the world was once flooded because the gods were angry, or because order needed to be reset, or because humanity grew too loud. You do not need to decide which version is correct to notice the function. The story transforms chaos into meaning. It gives the flood a reason, even if the reason is symbolic. This might support the idea that myths often behave like memory in ceremonial clothing. They store feelings and warnings and patterns. They say, remember what water can do. Remember that the world is not stable. Remember that survival requires community. Now we step into the fringe space safely labelled. A fringe idea proposes that ancient flood accounts preserve memory of a catastrophic global event, like a world-covering deluge or a sudden sea level surge remembered across cultures. This theory isn't widely accepted in its strongest forms, and the evidence we do have points more comfortably toward regional flooding river dynamics and the way stories travel and evolve. Still, the fringe idea persists because floods are universal and because humans love the thought that all our stories share one hidden root. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the interesting part is how the flood story travels. It moves from city to city, language to language, era to era, like a song that changes slightly every time someone sings it. The melody stays, the lyrics shift, and the feeling at the centre remains. Water rose and we survived, and we need to remember how. Second light joke. Sleepy Flood stories are basically humanity's longest running group chat. Someone posts the water is rising, and 4,000 years later people are still replying, same. Now the deeper question returns. If the tablets are records of memory, not myth, what does that actually mean for the flood story? It does not mean the gods are literal meteorologists. It does not mean the text is a newspaper report. It means the story might be preserving the emotional memory of living on unstable ground, the way you remember your own disasters not as perfect sequences, but as sensations. The smell of wet clay, the sound of rushing water in the dark, the way your stomach goes cold when you realize you cannot stop it. The way you count who made it out and who did not without wanting to speak their names too loudly. We are keeping this PG-13 so we do not dwell on graphic details. We let the tragedy stay at the edge like a shadow because the purpose is not to shock you. The purpose is to understand why a society would carve this into clay and carry it forward. One interpretation is that flood narratives function as cultural insurance. They teach preparedness. They reinforce moral behaviour. They justify authority. They explain loss. They provide a frame that makes rebuilding possible. If the flood was meaningless, then life feels cruel. If the flood had meaning, even symbolic meaning, then life becomes bearable again. Third light joke, soft and warm. Also, if you can blame the flood on arguing gods, you do not have to blame your cousin who built the house too close to the canal. Family peace matters. You stand at the canal's edge and you watch the water settle into evening. The surface grows darker. The sky's reflection deepens. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell or drum marks a ritual time, and you feel how the city is always measuring itself against nature, always trying to negotiate. This is where the section's central what-if lands. What if the Great Flood is a scrapbook? Not one photo, but many. Many floods, many years, many lives, pressed together into one story that can be remembered, recited, copied and stored. A story that says, this happened to us, and it can happen again, and here is how we make sense of it. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it aligns with how humans remember. We compress, we stylize, we ritualize, we turn experience into narrative, because narrative is the only container big enough for fear. And now with that water memory in you, you drift forward, leaving the canal behind, carrying the sound of water in the dark, like a lullaby that is slightly unsettling, but still a lullaby, because even fear, when it is understood, can become calm. And the tablets, somewhere in the archive, keep sleeping, holding the river inside them, waiting for your next quiet step. The water sound stays with you even as you move away from the canal, because once you've lived beside a river that can rewrite your life overnight, you start looking for names big enough to hold that power. And that is how you end up again and again at the threshold of the temple. You walk toward it slowly, the way you approach any place where people have been serious for a very long time. The street narrows. The noise changes. There are fewer casual arguments about grain measures and more quiet footsteps. The air carries a different scent now. Not only dust and reeds, but incense oil and that faint tang of stored grain behind thick walls. A temple is not just a building. It is a promise made visible. Most historians agree that temples in Sumerian city-states were major institutions tied to religious practice, economic activity, and political authority. They were places where offerings were brought, where goods were stored and redistributed, where labour could be organised, and where ceremonies helped bind communities to a shared sense of order. That's the solid ground again. The temple was not only about prayer, it was about systems, and systems love titles. You step into a courtyard where people wait in a loose line holding small offerings, grain, a jar of oil, a woven basket, someone's best attempt at a respectful posture. Off to the side, officials keep watch, not in a sinister way, more in the way a busy office keeps watch. You know the vibe of paperwork, except the paperwork is clay. You glance up at a statue or symbol associated with the deity, and you feel the tug of the word God. It is a word that in your modern mind arrives with baggage. It arrives with certainty or disbelief or arguments. But here in this courtyard, the word God might function differently. It might be less like a philosophical claim and more like a role in the city's operating system. One interpretation is that in some contexts, divine names can function like titles, representing powers, functions, and institutional identities, rather than always being experienced as literal beings in the sky. This doesn't erase faith or devotion, it just acknowledges that religious language often does practical work. It organises reality, it assigns meaning, it gives a city a way to talk about forces that feel larger than any single person. If you live in a world where water can flood your fields, where famine can arrive with a bad season, where disease can move quietly through neighbourhoods, you might not care whether the god of storms is metaphysically literal. You care that storms exist, that they have patterns, that you need a relationship with that pattern, even if the relationship is symbolic. And this is where you remember our larger question. If tablets are records of memory, not myth, then gods might be less like cartoon characters and more like memory handles, labels for lived experience. Archaeology suggests that temples were central hubs where record keeping happened, including records of offerings and distributions. That means the same institution that runs economic life also shapes sacred story. And when the same institution shapes story, it can standardize memory. It can decide what gets repeated in festivals, what gets sung in hymns, what gets copied in scribal schools. That's not conspiracy, that's simply how institutions work. Your modern world does it too. Schools decide which stories become history, media decides which events become important. Temples and palaces in Sumer did similar things, just with different tools and different assumptions. Now you walk along a corridor. The walls are thick. The light is dimmer. You hear a soft chant from somewhere deeper inside. You do not understand the words, but you understand the function, rhythm, repetition, a sound that makes the room feel ordered, even if the world outside is not. Here comes your first light joke, because temples may be sacred, but humans remain humans. You can practically hear an ancient priest muttering, "Please keep the line moving. We have 3 rituals and a barley inventory today." Even the divine needs scheduling. You stop near a doorway and notice a carved plaque or painted symbol. It marks a boundary. Beyond this point, only certain people enter. Priests, officials, scribes. The separation is physical and social. The sacred is also administrative. That fact alone can shift how you read stories about gods. Because if the temple is a gatekeeper of knowledge and resources, then the gods associated with that temple are also in a sense the public face of that authority. A careful reading might suggest that when a text says the god decreed, it could sometimes mean the institution decided, or the city's leadership established, or the accepted order requires. Not always, not in every case, but sometimes. It is a plausible interpretation for how divine language can encode human systems. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Historians still argue whether we should read Sumerian deities primarily as literal objects of devotion for ancient people, as symbolic personifications of natural and social forces, or as part of a political theological system that legitimized institutions and rulers. And the answer, once again, is probably messy. People can believe sincerely and also use belief to organize power. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Now, a quirky tidbit that makes this feel less abstract. Deities in Mesopotamia often had specific domains, associations, and even households tied to temples. Think of it like a cosmic department structure. Water here, grain there, war there, love there, justice there. That's not a perfect analogy, but it helps you feel how a city might distribute meaning. The world is complex, so you divide it into manageable, divine offices. Second light joke. Sleepy, if the universe is an organization chart, then the gods are middle managers. And yes, somebody is definitely director of flooding. You step back into the courtyard and watch people interact with the sacred. Some look nervous. Some look grateful. Some look like they are there because their grandmother told them to be, and honestly, that might be the most timeless emotion of all. You offer because your parents offered, and their parents offered, and because in a precarious world, tradition feels like a rope you can hold. Now we handle the fringe carefully. A fringe idea proposes that certain gods in ancient texts might refer to non-human visitors or advanced beings or lost civilizations remembered through symbolic language. This theory isn't widely accepted in mainstream scholarship, and the evidence we do have more strongly supports religious, cultural, and political interpretations grounded in human society. Still, the fringe idea persists because the language of the divine is grand, and grand language invites imaginative readings. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still ask a useful question: why do humans reach for non-human explanations? Sometimes it is because the achievements of early societies feel astonishing. Sometimes it is because mystery feels comforting, like the world has a hidden plan. And sometimes it is because the idea of just humans feels too ordinary for the size of our longing. But we do not need aliens to be moved by Sumer. We only need to notice that when you call something divine, you are often trying to protect it in memory. You are saying this matters. This is above ordinary argument. This is the structure that holds us. Now the cinematic what if for this section lands gently. What if the gods are not only beings but categories of memory? What if storm god is a way to remember storms not as random but as part of a relationship? What if grain goddess is a way to remember the miracle of harvest? What if city god is a way to remember that your community has identity, that your walls and canals and rituals form a living organism? And what if tablets, written by scribes working within temple systems, preserve those categories the way your brain preserves the categories of your own life, work, family, fear, hope, the things you return to again and again? You can almost feel the connection now. A hymn is not just praise, it is rehearsal. It keeps a category alive. Now we ground it again with a mainstream anchor you can hold. Temples did not simply float in spiritual abstraction. They coordinated labour-collected offerings, stored goods, and redistributed resources. That means the temple's memory is not only mythic, it is logistical. It is a calendar of grain and festivals intertwined. Third light joke. The temple is basically a combined church, bank, warehouse and HR department. And if you think modern institutions are complicated, imagine doing it all without email. You take a slow breath. The courtyard is calmer. The chant continues somewhere behind the walls. The sun outside is lowering, painting the brick with a softer gold. And you realize the deeper point. Whether gods are titles, beings, symbols, or all of the above, the language of the divine can function as an archive of what people felt mattered most. And if that is true, then myth may not be a lie. It may be a memory system, a way to store experience in a form strong enough to survive time. The solid ground remains under your feet, temples writing administration ritual. The mist remains above meaning, interpretation, imagination. And between them, the tablet small and heavy, holding a city's attempt to name what cannot be controlled. You leave the temple precinct slowly carrying the sense that the divine is not always a claim about the sky. Sometimes it is a claim about importance, about what must not be forgotten. And in the quiet of your room, as your eyes grow heavier, you can feel how a society's categories become your categories too, because you are listening, and listening is a kind of joining. The temple air still clings to you in a faint way like incense caught in fabric, even after you step back into the streets. And as the city settles into night, you start noticing something you did not notice in the daytime rush. The city has a pulse, not just the literal pulse of footsteps and donkeys and jars clinking in the dark, but a deeper pulse, a rhythm people share when they are trying to stay together. You hear it in the steady beat of work songs, in the repeated calls of guards, and most of all, in the sacred voice that rises and falls from behind temple walls. A hymn. It is not a single line of poetry drifting out like a movie soundtrack. It is structured. It is patterned. It circles back on itself. It repeats phrases the way waves repeat the shore. And you can feel almost immediately why this matters for our mystery. Most historians agree that Sumerian literary texts include hymns, prayers, and laments preserved on clay tablets, and that these texts were copied and transmitted through scribal education and temple culture. That is the solid ground again. These are not modern inventions. They exist as real artifacts, written in real wedge marks preserved because someone cared enough to press sound into clay. But the moment you listen, you realise hymns do not behave like ordinary storytelling. Stories move forward, hymns return. They repeat names, they repeat titles, they repeat praise. They repeat the same images from slightly different angles, like turning a small object in the hand until it feels familiar. A careful reading might suggest that this repetition is not merely style, it is function. Repetition is how memory sticks. It is how you teach a mind to hold something without dropping it. You step closer to the sound, still outside the temple, still respectful, still not trying to get yourself escorted out by a very tired priest with a schedule. The chanting is steady, and you notice how it changes your body. Your shoulders loosen, your breathing slows, your brain stops chasing 10 thoughts at once. The hymn is doing what lullabies do. It is making the world feel predictable for a moment. And this is where the memory theory grows stronger, not with proof, but with resonance. One interpretation is that hymns preserve lived feeling more than plot. They preserve the emotional weather of a city, gratitude after harvest, fear before war, anxiety in drought, relief after flood. A hymn can hold these feelings without needing to pin them to one specific Tuesday. It becomes a container large enough for a whole community's experience. You look at a tablet in your mind, one with lines arranged in careful order. It might have been copied in a school. It might have been used in ritual. It might have been both. The evidence we do have points to a world where texts move between learning and performance, between the quiet of training and the public space of ceremony. And when a text moves that way, it changes. It becomes a tool. It becomes a habit. It becomes cultural memory. Your modern mind tries to label it. Is it literature? Is it religion? Is it politics? Is it art? And the ancient world just shrugs and says yes. First light joke, soft and sleepy. You know how you hear a catchy chorus once and it lives in your head for 3 days? Congratulations, you have just experienced the ancient technology of repetition. Sumer invented the earworm, but in clay form. You listen for words you can recognize, even though you cannot truly translate them here in your imagination. Still you can catch what repetition does. The hymn does not only say a God is powerful, it says it again. It says it with different images. It builds a pattern so sturdy the mind cannot help but remember it. And the more people repeat it together, the more it becomes shared. A community does not only believe it synchronizes. Now consider the bigger idea we are holding gently. What if some tablets are records of memory, not myth? In that case, hymns might be one of the clearest examples, because a hymn is already a memory practice. It is not pretending to be a courtroom transcript. It is rehearsing meaning. Archaeology suggests that temples functioned as institutional centres where ritual and administration overlapped, and that scribes were deeply involved in producing and preserving texts. That means hymns may have been shaped by the same forces that shape everything else in a city: schedules, authority, tradition, and the need for stability. The temple does not only store grain, it stores a story about why grain matters. You notice the hymn's voice turns slightly, as if it is not only praising, but instructing. It tells you what is admirable, what is dangerous, what is sacred. It defines the category of order, and by doing that, it helps the city remember how to be itself. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it aligns with how humans work. Your own life is full of hymns, even if you do not call them that. The phrases you repeat to yourself, the family sayings, the little rules, the motivational lines, the warnings, the comforts. You repeat them not because they are exciting, but because they keep you oriented. Now, there is also a very practical side to hymn tablets that feels almost mundane. Some hymns and prayers were copied as exercises, meaning students practiced writing by reproducing sacred text. This is a mainstream safe possibility supported by how scribal education worked with repetition and copying. And it matters because it means the hymn is not only sung, it is drilled. It becomes part of the muscle memory of literacy. Second light joke. Imagine learning to write by copying sacred hymns all day. It is like doing handwriting practice, except your worksheet is holy, and your teacher can absolutely tell when you are bored. Now comes the scholarly uncertainty, and we say it clearly because that honesty is part of what keeps the channel safe. Historians still argue whether these hymns were primarily performed aloud in public rituals, used mainly as scribal school texts, or circulated in both settings depending on time and place. That debate matters because performance changes memory. A sung hymn lives in bodies. It travels on breath. It becomes communal. A school text lives in training. It becomes standardized. It becomes the official rhythm of language. If it does both, then the hymn becomes a bridge moving between private practice and public identity. You picture a festival night. The city gathers. Torches glow. The air smells of oil and warm bread. People stand close, not because they are sentimental, but because crowds are warmer and safer. A priest or singer begins, and the crowd answers with a refrain. Call and response. Repetition. A voice moving through hundreds of bodies like one slow wave. And then you picture the opposite scene. A schoolroom. A student copying the same hymn line again and again until the signs become correct. The student might not even believe in the words yet, not in a grown-up way. But the words enter the hand anyway, enter the brain anyway. The hymn becomes memory before it becomes meaning. Now we bring in a quirky, grounded detail that makes this feel real. Many ancient texts are damaged, broken, or incomplete, and hymns are no exception. That means what survives is sometimes partial, like hearing a song through a wall. A more cautious explanation could be that we often reconstruct patterns from fragments, and those reconstructions carry uncertainty. A missing wedge can change a word, a phrase, even the tone. Third light joke, gentle ancient text, reconstruction is basically the original autocorrect, except instead of your phone turning duck into something rude, it turns a missing wedge into a scholarly argument that lasts 50 years. Now, because you asked for that blend of mainstream and a touch of fringe, we step carefully into a fringe tidbit clearly labelled as such. A popular fringe idea claims that the sounds and rhythms of these hymns were designed as a kind of sonic technology meant to alter consciousness, open gateways, or encode hidden knowledge in repetition. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have points more comfortably toward ritual, devotion, education, and the ordinary human power of rhythm to calm and unify a group. Still, the fringe idea persists because chanting does affect the nervous system, and because mystery always grows in the spaces where we cannot fully reconstruct the original sound. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still extract something useful. Repetition can change how you feel. Rhythm can organize the mind. A hymn can quiet fear, strengthen belonging, and make uncertainty bearable. That does not require supernatural machinery. It requires humans being human. You listen again to the chant behind the wall, and now you hear it as a memory device in real time. It is teaching the city what to remember and how to remember it. It is preserving not only names of gods, but shared emotional posture, gratitude, humility, vigilance, hope. And if tablets are in part records of memory, then hymn tablets might be the cleanest proof of concept. Not proof that a myth is literal, but proof that ancient people knew how to store feeling in pattern. They pressed the pattern into clay so it could outlast the night. You step back from the temple wall and let the sound fade as you walk, but it does not fully leave you. It stays like a quiet rhythm inside your chest, and you realize the city is doing what you are doing right now. It is using repetition to settle the mind. It is using voice to make meaning durable. It is turning lived experience into something that can be carried through time, one careful wedge at a time, until even you far away in another era can still feel the pulse. That hymn rhythm keeps following you like a soft footstep. And now the world shifts again from the big ceremonial voice of temples to the quiet practical voice of the city's paperwork. Because if you want to test the memory idea without getting lost in cosmic poetry, you can do something very simple. You can look at the boring tablets, the ones nobody decorates into posters, the ones that list grain Labour beer rations, sheep and dates, the ones that look like the ancient equivalent of a spreadsheet, except nobody complains about the font because the font is literally wedges. Most historians agree that a huge portion of surviving Mesopotamian tablets are administrative recording transactions, allocations, inventories, and legal agreements. This is one of the most reliable anchors we have for daily life, because it is not trying to impress you, it is trying to function. And function is a form of honesty. You walk into a storage room or office. The air is cooler here. Thick walls keep heat out. The scent is practical, like grain dust oil and clay. Shelves hold tablets in stacks or baskets. It looks almost like a modern back room, except everything is made of mud and patience. A scribe sits cross-legged, working with the calm focus of someone who has accepted that their entire life is going to be counting things, but at least they are counting them indoors. You watch them press signs into clay. The motion is not dramatic, it is repetitive. But this is where the memory question turns sharp, because in repetition, tiny details stand out. A careful reading might suggest that even in administrative records, you sometimes catch glimpses of human life. Not on purpose, not like a diary entry, but accidentally, like a reflection in a window you did not notice. A tablet records rations for workers. It lists names, it lists amounts, it lists dates. On paper, it is dry. But look longer and the tablet begins to feel like a snapshot of a day. Because names are not abstract. Names are people. A name on a ration list might belong to a labourer who spent the day hauling reeds. It might belong to a widowed woman receiving grain. It might belong to a child assigned a small portion. The tablet does not tell you their thoughts, but it tells you they existed inside the system. It tells you someone's body needed food and an institution measured that need in counted units. One interpretation is that bureaucracy, by trying to be impersonal, actually preserves the most human fact of all dependence. The truth that nobody survives alone. The truth that a city runs on networks of giving and taking, obligation and distribution, and that those networks shape memory. You are tempted to romanticize it, but you slow down. We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues. So you do what good investigators do. You stay with the ordinary. You pick up a tablet in your mind, one that lists barley. Barley is everywhere. It is food. It is currency. It is power. Archaeology suggests barley and other staple crops were central to the economy, and that institutions tracked them carefully. That's mainstream and safe. Nothing mythical about it. But then you notice a detail. A note about a shortfall. A mention that something was delayed. A list of workers reassigned. A record of animals lost or moved. These small disruptions are where life leaks in. First light joke, ancient bureaucracy, is comforting because it proves that humans have always tried to solve chaos by making lists. It also proves that humans have always failed because the lists keep getting longer. Now, because you're listening to a bedtime history channel and not filing your taxes, you let yourself imagine the people behind the entries. A worker shows up, tired hands, cracked from rope and reed. They receive their ration, they go home, they share with family, they complain, they laugh, they sleep. Tomorrow they do it again. And somewhere a scribe writes it down, not because they care about the workers' feelings, but because the institution needs the record. And yet that record becomes memory. A tablet about rations does not only say barley distributed, it says people were fed. It says labour was organised. It says the city had a rhythm of survival. Now you find legal tablets, contracts, agreements, sales, loans. Most historians agree that written legal documents were part of Mesopotamian administrative life, including arrangements for property and obligations. This matters because law is another kind of memory. It is society saying, we will remember what you promised. You read the shapes, not the exact words, because we are not quoting and not citing, but you can still feel what law does. It freezes a moment of human intention into clay. It says, today these people agreed. Today this person owes. Today ownership shifted. If you have ever signed a lease, you know that feeling. You are turning your future into a set of words. You are trusting a document to remember for you. Second light joke. The difference is, if you sign a lease today, you can at least pretend you read it. In Sumer, the tablet is staring at you like, oh, you will remember this. I am literally made to haunt you. Now we bring in the required scholarly debate phrase, because it belongs here. Historians still argue whether the majority of administrative tablets should be read as direct windows into ordinary life, or primarily as records of institutional priorities that may distort the lived experience of people outside elite systems. That debate is important because it warns you not to over-romanticize. A rationalist does not represent everyone. It represents the people the institution counted. People outside that system might appear less or not at all. And silence in the archive is not the same as absence in reality. But even with that caution, the tablets still speak. They speak in numbers. They speak in categories. They speak in the shape of what the city cared to track. One interpretation is that these administrative tablets create a background hum of memory, like the constant low noise of a refrigerator in your kitchen. You do not notice it until it stops. The city's record keeping is like that. It becomes so normal that people stop noticing it, but it shapes everything. Now, a quirky tidbit that makes this feel tangible. Many administrative tablets are small and standardized, and some were sealed or marked with cylinder seals to show authorization. That means the act of recording is also an act of control. A seal says this is official, this is recognized, this is part of the system. And systems do something to memory. They select what counts. You start to see the bridge again. If a city's everyday life is recorded in structured ways, then the city's sacred stories might also carry that structure. Roles, offices, decrees, distributions, floods as resets, kingship as a transfer, divine favour as a kind of cosmic allocation. The shapes of bureaucracy can seep into the shapes of myth. Now we step into fringe material clearly labelled, because some people love to push these tablets into a dramatic secret. A fringe idea proposes that administrative records hide coded histories, as if grain totals secretly encode astronomical events, or as if ration lists are camouflage for forbidden knowledge. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the more cautious explanation could be that these tablets are doing exactly what they look like, tracking resources and obligations. Still, the fringe idea persists because humans dislike the idea that most of the past was paperwork. We want it to be epic. We want it to be mysterious. We want every line to be a prophecy. But the truth is, paperwork is epic in its own way, because paperwork is how a city stays alive. Now comes the cinematic what if, gentle and honest. What if bureaucracy accidentally preserved human stories? What if the most faithful record of what life felt like is not the myth about a hero, but the small tablet that says, on this day this person received barley, this animal was counted, this worker was assigned. Not because it is poetic, but because it is real. Because it is the structure that held the day together. You let your mind hover over one entry, one name. You imagine the person's face, not because you can know it, but because imagination is a way to honour the fact that they existed. You imagine them going home, hearing the temple hymn in the distance, feeling the night air cool, eating bread, maybe drinking beer, listening to someone tell a story about the gods and the flood and the king. And you realise the city has two memory streams running at once. One is sacred and sung. One is practical and counted. Both are memory. Both are pressed into clay. And if you want to understand Sumerian tablets as records of memory, not myth, you may have to accept that memory is not one thing. It is the way a society holds on to what it needs to survive, whether that is a ration list or a hymn, a contract or a legend. You step out of the storage room and the night air feels cooler. The city's sounds are softer. Somewhere a dog barks, somewhere a guard calls, somewhere a temple chant continues like a heartbeat, and you carry the quiet certainty of it. Not a certainty of answers, but a certainty that even the most ordinary tablet can be a doorway into human life if you listen long enough. You step out of that cool storage room and back into the open air, and for a moment the city feels simpler, almost peaceful. The night has a way of doing that. It lowers the volume on the marketplace, softens the edges of buildings, and makes every doorway look like it might be hiding a story. And then you look up. The sky over Mesopotamia is big in a way modern city skies rarely are. No neon glow, no constant headlights, just darkness and stars and a thin band of light where the Milky Way stretches like spilled dust. The kind of sky that makes you understand why ancient people felt watched by the heavens, not in a paranoid way, but in a reverent, quietly nervous way. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cultures practiced divination in many forms, including reading omens from celestial events, unusual occurrences, dreams, and sometimes the inspection of animal organs, especially the liver, as part of structured systems meant to interpret the will of the gods and the risks of the future. That is the solid ground. These practices were real institutionalized and taken seriously, especially when kings and officials needed guidance in an uncertain world. Now you might be tempted to roll your modern eyes a little because you live in an era where your phone can predict the weather and still somehow cannot predict that it will rain exactly when you forget an umbrella. But pause with the ancient logic for a moment. When your survival depends on harvest timing, flood timing, political timing, and the moods of powerful people, the future is not a curiosity, it is a threat. So you build a system for reading signs. A careful reading might suggest that omen culture is not just superstition, but a kind of mental weather report. A way to map anxiety, a way to give structure to dread. If you can name a risk, you can plan for it. If you can interpret a pattern, you can feel less helpless. You walk along a street where small lamps flicker in doorways. People talk in low voices. Somewhere a baby cries, then quiets. Somewhere a couple argues softly, because even in the ancient world, people still choose bedtime as the perfect time to discuss everything they have ever been annoyed about. First light joke, humans truly are timeless. The only thing that changes is the furniture and the level of dust. You pass a small gathering in a courtyard. An elder or a specialist speaks and others listen. They are discussing a dream. Not like a casual "I dreamed, I forgot my math test" dream, but the kind of dream that feels heavy in the chest, the kind you wake from and know your mind is trying to warn you about something, even if you cannot explain what. One interpretation is that dreams in these cultures could be treated as messages, not necessarily because every dream is a literal telegram from a deity, but because dreams are where your brain processes what you cannot safely say in daylight. Fear, desire, worry, regret. A dream can be an honest mirror, and if your society already believes the divine speaks in patterns, then dreams become a legitimate source of information. You think about that because it makes the tablets feel different. A tablet that records an omen is not just an exotic curiosity, it is a record of someone trying to negotiate uncertainty. It is memory in the form of risk management. Archaeology suggests that omen texts were organized into lists and series with if this then that patterns showing systematic thinking. That matters. It means these were not random guesses tossed into the air. They were structured, catalogued, recorded, repeated, and repetition once again is a memory engine. You imagine a scribe copying omen statements the way you copy a recipe. If the moon looks a certain way, if a star flickers strangely, if a sheep is born with an unusual mark, if a dream repeats 3 nights in a row, then the text offers a meaning, a warning, a recommended response. Second light joke. Sleepy, it is basically the ancient version of scrolling through symptoms online, except instead of you have a headache turning into you have 6 minutes to live, it turns into the kingdom should postpone the campaign. Same vibe, different stakes. Now you shift your attention upward again. The stars feel steady, but the ancient mind sees movement everywhere. The moon changes shape. Planets wander. Eclipses arrive like sudden corrections to the sky's calm face. And in a world where you do not have physics as a shared explanatory framework, the heavens are not just objects. They are signals. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm exactly how each person felt when they saw an eclipse or a strange halo around the moon. We cannot confirm whether they experienced fear or excitement or all of it at once, but we can notice that the desire to interpret the sky is deeply human, and that omen texts preserve that desire with astonishing dedication. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian divination should be understood primarily as religious belief, as political strategy for kingship, as early empirical observation organized into patterns, or as a psychological tool for managing uncertainty in complex societies. That debate matters for our theme, because if omen culture is partly about managing uncertainty, then these texts are records of memory, not myth. They record what a society feared, what it noticed, what it tried to control. Now a quirky tidbit, grounded enough to feel real and strange at the same time. Some divination traditions use clay models and diagrams, including representations of the liver, to map meanings and omens in a structured way. Imagine holding a clay model of an organ and treating it like a cosmic map. It sounds bizarre, but it also shows something practical. They were externalizing interpretation, making it teachable and repeatable. Third light joke. Gentle. You think your office meetings are intense, but imagine a meeting where someone says the left lobe indicates potential danger and everyone nods like that is normal. And honestly, after a few weeks, it probably was normal. Now we step carefully into the cinematic what if, because the night sky almost demands it, but we keep it honest. What if the sky was their memory palace? Not a literal palace in the clouds, but a mental architecture. A way to store important events and warnings in a shared map everyone could look at. You tell stories about constellations. You track the moon. You remember the eclipse that happened when a certain king took power. You build a calendar from the heavens. Over time, the sky becomes a giant communal notebook. And then the tablet becomes the second notebook, the one that stores the sky notebook. It is layers of memory. Sky to story, story to clay, clay to you. One interpretation is that omen tablets preserve not only belief, but observational habit. People watched patterns. They compared past and present. They categorized. They recorded. Even if their conclusions differ from modern science, the method of paying attention is recognizable. It's the same human instinct that makes you check the horizon for rain or look at a friend's face and know something is off before they say a word. Now, because this topic attracts dramatic claims, we handle fringe safely and clearly. A fringe idea proposes that ancient omen texts are coded prophecies that predict modern events with precision, as if the tablets were meant to be time capsules of future history. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have points more strongly toward contemporaneous interpretation, political guidance, and religious worldview rather than literal prediction across millennia. Still, the fringe idea persists because humans love the fantasy that someone somewhere already knows what is coming. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more interesting truth is simpler. Ancient people felt what you feel uncertainty about tomorrow, and they built systems to soften that uncertainty. That is not shameful. That is survival. You slow your steps, letting the cool night air settle on your skin. You imagine someone in Sumer standing exactly where you stand now, looking up, feeling small, feeling exposed, feeling the need for reassurance. They go to a specialist. They bring a dream. They report a strange star. They ask what it means. And the response they get is not merely the God said, but a structured attempt to turn chaos into something speakable. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it fits the larger theme. In these texts, myth and memory are not enemies. They are partners. Myth gives memory a shape. Memory gives myth a heartbeat. You glance back toward the temple precinct. The chanting is faint now, like a heartbeat behind walls. The city is quieter, but not asleep. The night is when worries get louder inside the mind. And the omen culture, the dream culture, the sky watching it is all part of the same project. To make fear manageable, to make the future less sharp, to store uncertainty in a form you can hold. And as you turn your gaze upward one more time, you let the stars blur just a little. Not because you are losing focus, but because you are drifting the way the mind drifts when it is ready to sleep. The sky becomes soft. The city becomes distant. The tablet becomes a quiet weight in the imagination. A record not only of what happened, but of what it felt like to not know what would happen next. The night sky stays with you like an after image when you look away, and you can feel how easily the mind turns patterns into meaning when the world is too wide to hold all at once. You drift back through the sleeping streets, and the city feels quieter now, like the walls themselves are listening. And somewhere in that quiet, you remember something important. Not everything that survives from the ancient world is reliable. Not every claim that attaches itself to a tablet belongs there. And if you want to treat these tablets as records of memory, you also have to treat human imagination as part of the story, because imagination is not a modern invention. People have always embellished. People have always misread. People have always sold a thrilling version of events to someone who wanted to believe. So tonight, without turning this into a scolding lecture, you step into a different kind of room. A room where the air feels slightly suspicious. It is the room where quirks, hoaxes, and persistent fringe interpretations gather like moths around lamplight. Most historians agree that our understanding of ancient texts depends on careful excavation context and scholarly methods, and that fragments, damaged tablets, or isolated artifacts can be misunderstood or misrepresented when removed from their archaeological setting. That is solid ground. It is not about cynicism, it is about caution. Context is what turns a piece of clay into evidence instead of a blank canvas for wishful thinking. You hold a tablet in your mind, but this one is not a neat museum label tablet. It is a rumour tablet. The kind people talk about online. The kind that proves something dramatic in a headline, then turns out to be less dramatic when you look closely. A careful reading might suggest that many viral claims about ancient artifacts thrive because most people will never see the object, never touch the context, never study the script. The distance creates a gap, and gaps invite fantasies. That does not mean every surprising claim is false. It means the human mind is eager to fill blanks with excitement. First light, joke, gentle. If you have ever watched someone confidently explain a meme they did not understand, you already understand how ancient hoaxes work. Confidence is the oldest technology. Now, you are not here to mock anyone. You are here to keep your channel safe and credible, which means you do something simple. You separate solid ground from mist. Solid ground includes real texts, real excavations, real known collections, and consistent patterns in language and material culture. Mist includes claims that rely on one blurry photo, one sensational translation, one anonymous source, or one trust me bro, energy that would not survive 5 minutes in a serious archive. One interpretation is that fringe readings persist not only because people are gullible, but because people are hungry. Hungry for wonder, hungry for meaning, hungry for a past that feels alive and secret. And when you are hungry, you are less picky about where the food comes from. You walk through an imaginary marketplace of ideas, and you notice how easily mystery becomes certainty if nobody pushes back. Someone says, this tablet reveals the true origin of humanity. Someone else repeats it. Someone adds dramatic music. And suddenly the claim feels real, not because the evidence changed, but because repetition changed the feeling. Repetition is powerful. We have already seen that in hymns and rituals. But repetition can preserve errors too. Now you pause and remind yourself softly the channel's guiding ethic. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. That means you do not say confirmed. You do not say proven. You do not say the truth. You say one interpretation, a debated theory, a fringe idea. The evidence is thin. This is suggestive, not conclusive. And you keep the atmosphere calm because your viewer is in bed. They do not need a fight. They need a mystery that respects their intelligence. Historians still argue whether certain ancient texts that sound extraordinary to modern ears are genuinely describing unusual events, are metaphorical or poetic conventions, or have been misunderstood due to translation gaps and missing context. That debate is crucial because it shows you can be open to mystery without becoming careless. Now, a quirky tidbit that fits this theme. Even in antiquity, scribes copied texts, adapted them, and sometimes introduced mistakes. There were misunderstandings, regional variations, and changes over time. In other words, the ancient world already had misinformation, it just moved slower and came in clay. Second light joke. Imagine waiting 3 weeks for your fake news to dry in the sun before you can share it. The ancient internet was patient. You continue walking. You pass the temple district again, and you feel how easy it is to turn authority into certainty. If a priest says something, it carries weight. If a scribe records something, it gains permanence. But permanence is not the same as truth in the modern scientific sense. It is truth in the sense of, this is what we chose to preserve. And that brings you back to the core idea. If tablets are records of memory, then they are records of what people believed mattered, believed was true, believed was worth repeating. Memory is not always accurate. Memory is a selective storyteller. It is a curator. It picks highlights and edits out awkward details. A more cautious explanation could be that many ancient texts blend genres in ways that modern categories struggle to capture. Something can be theological, political, poetic, and historical all at once. And when modern people demand a single label, they can fall into extremes, either dismiss it all as myth or believe it all as literal fact. The more balanced stance is the one you are practicing tonight. Now we step into a cinematic what if that fits the theme of hoaxes and fringe without endorsing them. What if the biggest mystery is not whether the tablets hide secret truths, but why we want them to? What if the human hunger for a hidden story is itself a form of memory inherited across generations? A deep instinct that says the world is bigger than the surface. There is always more. There is always a door behind the door. That instinct can lead to beauty. It can also lead to people believing nonsense. So the wise move is not to kill the instinct. It is to guide it, to keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now, because this topic is full of dramatic fringe claims, we acknowledge one safely. A popular rumour claims there are banned tablets that reveal forbidden origins and were intentionally hidden to protect modern narratives. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have points more strongly to ordinary reasons for limited access, fragmenteer. Discoveries, museum storage, constraints, incomplete cataloguing, and the slow pace of scholarship. Still, the rumour persists because it feels like a movie plot, and movie plots are comforting. They turn complexity into villains and heroes. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more interesting reality is quieter. Many tablets are simply broken. Many are untranslated. Many are in storage because there are more artifacts than there are specialists and resources to process them quickly. Mystery can come from mundane overload, not only secret schemes. Third light joke. Sleepy. The most ancient conspiracy might just be we are behind on paperwork, which honestly is the most believable conspiracy of all. You stop in a quiet street, the night air is still, the stars are steady, and you feel the story's centre shift into something calmer and more mature. Treating tablets as memory does not mean believing every thrilling claim. It means respecting the human process. The process of preserving, of copying, of telling stories that make life bearable, of sometimes getting details wrong, of sometimes letting hope and fear shape the narrative. Memory is not a camera, it is a storyteller. And the tablets are not just data, they are the material trace of that storyteller learning how to speak. You breathe in, you breathe out, and you carry that gentle caution forward, because the next step in this journey is to look at how translation and missing wedges can turn memory into myth or myth into memory with a single small shift of meaning. You keep that calm caution in your pocket like a small smooth stone, because now you're heading into the place where the past becomes fragile in a different way. Not fragile because of floods. Not fragile because of kings or gods. Fragile because of language. Because a tablet can survive 4,000 years and still lose a single wedge mark, and that missing wedge can tilt an entire sentence the way one missing screw can make a chair wobble forever. You return to the archive in your mind, back to the warm lamplight and the quiet shelves. The room feels gentler now, like it trusts you a little more because you have stopped demanding certainty and started practicing patience. Most historians agree that cuneiform tablets often survive in fragmented or damaged condition, and that reading them depends on careful reconstruction, knowledge of languages, and contextual comparison with other texts. That is the solid ground. This work is slow, meticulous, and full of judgment calls because the past does not arrive as a clean PDF. You sit at a table with a broken tablet. It looks like a cookie that's snapped in half, except you are not allowed to eat it, and also it is older than most civilizations you can name. One edge is chipped, several lines are incomplete, the wedge marks are clear in places and smudged in others. You can feel the temptation already. Your modern brain wants to fill the gaps quickly, to guess the missing words, to create a smooth story. But the responsible mind moves slower. One interpretation is that translation is never purely mechanical. It is a series of choices. You decide whether a word is literal or metaphorical. You decide whether a phrase is formulaic or personal. You decide which meaning fits best when a sign can mean multiple things depending on context. And this matters because the question we are exploring is not just what do the tablets say, but what are the tablets doing? Are they myth? Are they memory? Are they both? Translation choices can push a text toward one feeling or the other. You imagine a scholar looking at a sign that could be read in more than one way. They consult parallels. They consider grammar. They consider the genre of the text. They consider what is typical. They consider what is possible. And still uncertainty remains because the tablet does not always give you enough. The evidence we do have points to a world where many texts were copied and exist in multiple versions, which can help reconstruction. If one tablet is broken, another copy might preserve the missing line, but not always. Sometimes the missing wedge is missing everywhere and the past stays stubbornly incomplete. First light, joke, gentle. If you have ever tried to assemble furniture with instructions that are missing, step 3, you understand ancient translation. You stare at the pieces and think, surely someone is laughing at me. The difference is, IKEA is only mildly cursed. Cuneiform is historically cursed. Now you look closer at the broken line. Maybe it is a myth about a god and a river. Maybe it is a lament. Maybe it is a list that includes a rare term. You cannot know immediately. And that is where modern misunderstandings grow. People see a fragmentary translation and they treat it like a complete declaration. They turn might into is. They turn possibly into proves. They turn a careful scholarly guess into a headline with bold letters. We are not doing that here. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. A careful reading might suggest that the more damaged a tablet is, the more humble you must be about conclusions. A gap is not permission to invent. It is an invitation to admit uncertainty. Now you think about your larger theme again. If tablets are records of memory, not myth, then the process of translation becomes part of that story, because memory itself is translation. Your brain translates experience into narrative. It compresses, it selects, it fills gaps, it smooths rough edges. It sometimes turns uncertainty into certainty because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Translation is the same temptation but in a more disciplined form. And that's why scholars argue. Historians still argue whether certain passages should be read as literal descriptions, poetic, conventions, symbolic language, or rhetorical exaggeration shaped by genre and cultural context. That debate is not a flaw, it is a sign of care. It is people refusing to pretend they know more than they do. Now here is a quirky tidbit that makes the stakes feel real. Some cuneiform signs can look similar, and scribal hands vary. A hurried scribe, a tired scribe, a regional style, a damaged surface, all of it can create ambiguity. Imagine trying to read a handwritten note where the M might be an NN, and then multiply that by thousands of years and a different writing system. That is the daily reality of this work. Second light joke. You know how your doctor's handwriting can be interpreted as either take 2 pills or adopt a goat. Translation sometimes feels like that, except the goat is an ancient deity and the prescription is an empire's memory. Now the cinematic what if for this section lands softly. What if a missing wedge is the moment where myth is born? Not because someone intended to lie, but because gaps invite imagination. If the original line was the river rose and the reconstructed line becomes the river rose in anger, the emotional tone changes. If the original phrase was routine and the translation makes it dramatic, you feel a different world. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but you can see how the past can shift in the act of reading. Now we handle fringe safely because translation gaps are fertile ground for dramatic claims. A fringe idea proposes that mainstream scholars intentionally mistranslate tablets to hide extraordinary meanings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have points more strongly toward the ordinary reality translation is hard. Scholars disagree openly, and debates are published precisely because no single authority controls interpretation. Still, the fringe idea persists because it feels satisfying. It gives uncertainty a villain. But the real villain is simpler. Time, damage, incomplete context, human limitation. And honestly, that is a more poetic villain anyway. Now you move to another tablet, one in better condition, and you notice how different it feels. The lines are complete. The grammar is clearer, the meaning stabilizes, the voice comes through more strongly. You realize the past is not uniformly mysterious. Some parts are sharp, some parts are fog. One interpretation is that when you read a complete hymn, you can more confidently see memory techniques like repetition. When you read a broken myth fragment, you must be careful not to project your own modern hunger for drama into the gaps. So tonight you practice a simple ritual. You breathe. You read slowly. You accept what you can accept. You label what you cannot confirm. You let uncertainty be part of the story, because uncertainty is honest, and honest is safe, and honest also happens to be soothing. There is something relaxing about not forcing the universe to give you a final answer. Third light joke, quiet. Your brain at bedtime is like, please solve the mystery of the universe. And the responsible narrator is like, how about we solve the mystery of you falling asleep first? You set the broken tablet down in your mind and look at the lamplight pooling on the table. The clay is still, the room is still, the wedges are small and patient, and you realise that translation is not just a technical process, it is an ethical one. It is how you decide to speak for someone who cannot correct you. So as we move forward, we will keep doing the same thing. We will use cautious language. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. We will treat the tablets as memory devices, but we will remember that our own reading is also a form of memory making, because the past is not only written in clay, it is also written in the choices we make when we try to understand it. You stay in the archive a moment longer, letting the lamplight remind you that every translation choice is a kind of responsibility, and then you step back out into the city where those choices were never abstract. They were tied to bread, to work, to who ate tonight and who did not. Because there is a truth that sits underneath almost every sacred story in a city like this. Someone is counting something. You walk toward the temple again, but this time you do not approach it as a place of incense and hymns. You approach it as a place of storage rooms, schedules, and steady flows of goods moving in and out like tides. The courtyard is busy. People arrive with offerings, officials watch, scribes sit with clay. The air smells of oil, grain dust and warm brick. The whole scene feels like a sacred warehouse that happens to have a choir. Most historians agree that temples in Mesopotamian city life were deeply involved in economic activity, including collecting offerings and managing redistribution of goods, and that administrative tablets record rations, deliveries, and labour connected to these institutions. That is the solid ground, and it matters because it means the temple is not only a spiritual centre, it is an organiser, a coordinator, a place where survival becomes structured. You watch a procession of small offerings arrive. Someone brings barley, someone brings oil, someone brings a woven basket of dates, someone brings an animal led carefully with the tense politeness of a person who does not want to upset anything powerful. The offerings are religious, yes, but they are also practical. They become stored goods. They become rations. They become support for workers. They become part of the system that keeps the city from falling apart when the river gets moody. A scribe presses wedges into clay. They record who brought what. They record quantities. They record dates. The tablet does not care about your emotions. It cares about accounting, and you can feel the strange intimacy of it. A person's gesture of devotion becomes a line of numbers. First light, joke, gentle. You are offering your best barley to the divine, And the temple is like, thank you, you have been entered into the system. Heaven has receipts. You follow the goods into a storage area. Thick walls, cooler air, stacks of jars, baskets, sealed containers. The place smells like grain and clay and the faint tang of oil. It is not romantic, but it is essential. This is where the temple's power lives, not only in hymns but in inventory. A careful reading might suggest that when you live in a world where food can vanish, with one bad season, institutions that store and redistribute goods become more than practical. They become sacred. They become the visible proof that order exists, and once an institution holds that kind of practical power, it also shapes the stories people tell about why the world works. One interpretation is that economic structure can seep into sacred storytelling, not in a cynical, cartoonish way where everything is fake, more in the subtle way where the shape of daily life influences the shape of myth. If the temple is the hub where goods come in and go out, then stories about gods might mirror that flow. Offerings become favour. Favour becomes protection. Protection becomes harvest. Harvest becomes offering again. A loop, a rhythm, a cosmic ledger. You think about how often sacred language sounds transactional even in modern life. Blessings, debts, sacrifice, reward, punishment. These words carry moral weight, but they also carry the logic of exchange. In a temple economy, exchange is not only financial, it is the grammar of survival. You watch labour assignments happen. A supervisor points, workers move, someone carries jars, someone repairs a wall, someone dredges a canal, someone hauls reeds, and somewhere nearby a scribe records ration distributions, because in a complex institution, labour becomes a category you can manage. The worker becomes a line item. That sounds cold, but it is also the way large groups avoid chaos. The evidence we do have points to extensive ration systems in which institutions allocated food and drink to labourers, and that becomes a window into how organised these societies were. It is not only a spiritual world, it is a logistical world. Second light joke, sleepy. If you have ever tried organising a group chat dinner plan, you understand why temples needed scribes. A city is like that, except the consequence of bad coordination is not. We ate late, it is we starved. No pressure. Now you step back into the courtyard and listen again to the hymns. They sound different now that you have seen the storage rooms. The chant is still soothing, but you can also hear it as part of a system that aligns emotion with structure. It reinforces the idea that order is sacred. It encourages participation. It makes the institution feel like a living relationship rather than an impersonal machine. This is where the memory theme gets richer. If tablets are records of memory, not myth, then the temple economy is a memory engine. It records who contributed, who received, who worked, who belonged. It turns community into entries. It makes the city legible to itself. And then you notice something small that feels almost tender. A tablet lists rations for many people, and in that list, some entries are smaller, Some are larger, some have special notes. This is not a diary, but it hints at differences in status, role, vulnerability. A city remembers people in unequal ways. The archive has blind spots and sharp spots. Historians still argue whether temple economies were primarily centralized and dominant in organizing most daily production and labor, or whether household and private activity played a larger role than the surviving administrative records suggest. That debate matters because it shapes how you read the tablets. If the temple is the main engine, then the texts reflect a broad social reality. If household life is larger than the archive reveals, then the texts reflect an institutional lens, powerful but partial. Either way, the temple's record-keeping is not the whole story, but it is an important story because it shows how the city kept itself alive. Now a quirky tidbit that keeps things human. In Russian contexts, beer appears often enough to become almost comical because you can picture workers receiving bread and beer as normal compensation. This is widely discussed as part of the daily economy and diet, and it makes the ancient world feel close. People were tired, people wanted calories, people enjoyed a drink, and the institution counted it carefully. Third light joke. The temple economy is basically saying we pay you in bread and beer, and you are like, I have questions, and the scribe is like, please direct all questions to the god in charge of labour allocations. Good luck. Now we touch the fringe corner carefully, because whenever economics and gods mix, some people love to claim secret schemes. A fringe idea proposes that temple accounting hides coded rituals or concealed power structures meant to manipulate the population through fear of the divine. This theory isn't widely accepted as a blanket explanation, and the evidence we do have points more strongly toward practical institutional management combined with sincere religious worldview. Still, the fringe idea persists because temples are powerful, and humans have always suspected that powerful institutions have hidden layers. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the useful takeaway is not paranoia, it is awareness. Sacred stories can reinforce systems. Systems can influence sacred stories, and that does not automatically mean deception. It means culture is woven. Threads of belief, survival authority, and memory all twist together. Now the cinematic what if for this section settles in gently like a blanket. What if memory in a city like this is counted? Not only in years or reigns, but in barley and breath. A delivery of grain is not just grain, it is winter survival. It is a child eating. It is a worker having strength to repair a canal. A jar of oil is not just oil, it is light at night. It is cooking. It is a ritual lamp in a temple. It is a way to push back darkness. What if the city measures its own life by these flows? Goods in, goods out, work done, hymns sung, offerings given, fear soothed. The tablets become the pulse record of a living organism, each wedge a heartbeat. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it matches what you have been seeing. The temple economy is not only administration, it is a memory architecture. It stores not only resources but relationships. Who owes what? Who belongs where? Which gods receive which offerings? Which festivals occur when? Which stories are repeated to keep the loop turning? You stand at the edge of the courtyard as the night grows deeper. The hymn continues behind the walls. Somewhere workers are still moving goods. Somewhere a scribe is still pressing wedges into clay. The city is alive in its systems, alive in its stories. And you realise something quietly profound. When people say myth, they often imagine distance from reality. But in a temple economy, the sacred and the practical are braided so tightly that the story and the rationalist are not opposites. They are neighbours. They sit on the same shelves. They serve the same purpose in different languages. One language counts, the other comforts. Both remember. And you carry that forward into the night, feeling how a city can store itself in clay, not only in grand legends, but in the steady ordinary flow of barley and breath. You walk deeper into the temple complex, as if you have been given a temporary pass, the kind that says you can look, but please do not touch anything. And also please do not accidentally reinvent the economy by moving one jar. The air changes as you cross thresholds. Outside the city smells like dust and people. Inside it smells like stored grain oil, warm brick, and the faint sharpness of something fermented that reminds you the ancient world did not waste calories. Most historians agree that temple complexes in Sumerian cities were not only ritual spaces, but also centres of administration and production with personnel who manage storage labour assignments, craft activity, and the timing of festivals and offerings. That is the solid ground. The temple is a place where devotion and logistics share the same roof. You pass a row of storage rooms with heavy doors and sealed containers. You can almost hear the soft scrape of jar lids, the quiet shuffle of baskets, the low conversation of workers who have learned to keep their voices down around valuable goods. A scribe sits nearby with a lump of clay recording movements in and out. If a jar leaves, it exists on a tablet. If a basket arrives, it becomes a wedge mark fact. First light, joke sleepy. This is the part of the temple tour where you realise the divine runs on inventory. Somewhere a god is definitely reviewing quarterly barley numbers. You follow a group of workers into a workshop area. The sound is different here. More tapping, more scraping, more steady craft noises. Someone shapes clay into small items. Someone repairs tools. Someone is preparing reed mats. The work feels ordinary, but the setting makes it feel purposeful, as if every motion belongs to a larger rhythm. It is easy to see why a culture would experience the temple as the centre of order. Not because everything is perfect, but because everything is accounted for. A careful reading might suggest that when a society experiences its stability through systems like storage and redistribution, those systems become metaphors in sacred language. If your survival depends on measured rations, then favour can sound like allocation. If your safety depends on the canal being maintained, then divine protection can sound like infrastructure. If your community depends on festivals that coordinate labour pauses and shared meals, then sacred time becomes a schedule you can live inside. One interpretation is that the temple economy does not merely support religious life, it shapes the stories religion tells. It supplies the mental furniture. The metaphors of balance, debt, purity, offering reward, and restoration do not float in a vacuum. They grow from a world where goods move, obligations exist, and survival is negotiated in measured units. You turn a corner and find a small space where offerings are prepared. You can smell oil and grain and something roasted. People bring what they can. Some offerings are modest, some are impressive. The scene is not theatrical, it is practical devotion. A worker receives an instruction, follows a routine, and the offering becomes part of a cycle. It enters the institution, and then it is transformed into redistribution, ritual use, or support for temple personnel. Second light joke. You know you're in an ancient temple economy when donation quietly becomes membership fee, and the benefits include, please do not let the river destroy my house. Now you watch the scribe again. The stylus presses wedges into clay, and you realise the temple is not only a storehouse of goods, it is a storehouse of promises, a record of what was given, a record of what is owed, a record of what should happen next. That is memory structured and externalized. And then something else clicks. If the temple is where goods circulate, it is also where communal emotion circulates. Festivals happen here. Processions, hymns, shared meals. These events are not just spiritual, they reinforce a social contract. They remind people they belong to something larger than their household. They make the city feel like one body. Most historians agree that festivals and ritual calendars played major roles in Mesopotamian city life, coordinating communal gatherings and institutional activity. Even if the exact details shift over time and place, the broader pattern is clear: ritual time, organised social life. That means the temple is a time machine in a different sense. It turns the year into repeatable meaning. You imagine a festival day. The city looks different. People dress a little better. The streets fill. The temple courtyard becomes crowded. Offerings arrive. Hymns rise. The gods are praised. The institution distributes food and drink to workers or participants according to custom and status. The day feels both joyful and serious because joy itself can be a survival technology. When life is precarious, a festival is not a luxury, it is a pressure release valve. Third light joke, gentle. The festival is basically ancient society saying, we have been stressed for months, so please enjoy this controlled amount of happiness, approved by the gods and fully documented by scribes. Now the scholarly debate lands naturally here, because it always does when you talk about how much power institutions had. Historians still argue whether temple institutions dominated the economy to such a degree that most production and distribution flowed through them, or whether temple records mainly reflect the institutional slice of life, while household and private activity remained larger than the archive suggests. That debate matters because it shapes how you interpret sacred language. If the temple is the main economic engine, then the metaphors of sacred exchange might reflect the lived reality of most people. If household life is larger than the archive reveals, then the sacred exchange metaphors might reflect the worldview of institutions more than the full diversity of experience. Either way, the connection is still there. Systems create patterns. Patterns create language. Language creates stories. Now for a quirky tidbit that feels small but important, measures and standard units mattered. Temple economies relied on consistent ways to count grain oil and labour rations, and that consistency often appears in the structured form of tablets and ceilings. The boring discipline of measurement becomes a kind of cultural spine. When your world is uncertain, measurement is comfort. It says at least this part is knowable. And that is where the memory idea gets sharper again. If you live in a culture where value is measured and recorded constantly, you may begin to imagine cosmic value the same way. You may imagine the gods keeping balance, keeping accounts, weighing actions, resetting disorder. Not because that is literally how the universe works, but because it is how your society has learned to stabilize itself. Now we handle a fringe tidbit carefully because temple economies attract dramatic theories. A fringe idea proposes that temple accounting was intentionally designed as a form of population control, with sacred fear used as a tool to enforce compliance through ration dependence. This theory isn't widely accepted as a universal explanation, and the evidence we do have points more strongly toward practical governance intertwined with sincere religious worldview, not a single secret plan. Still, the fringe idea persists because it feels modern. It fits the way people imagine institutions. It offers a simple story about power. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more useful insight is gentler. Institutions shape behaviour, ritual shapes emotion, economics shapes metaphors. And in a world where survival depends on cooperation, these forces naturally align, sometimes by design, sometimes by evolution, often by both. Now the cinematic what if for this section settles over everything like a soft cloth. What if the temple economy is the hidden grammar behind so many sacred texts? What if blessing feels like a full granary because full granaries saved real lives? What if purity feels like an unbroken seal because seals protected goods? What if divine anger feels like sudden scarcity because scarcity was terrifying? What if restoration feels like redistribution after hardship because that was the moment a city could breathe again? This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it matches the way humans translate life into meaning. You take the strongest experiences you have and you build your sacred language out of them. You step back into the courtyard and watch the final workers for the night secure doors and check storage. A guard calls out softly. A lamp is adjusted. The temple is settling into its own kind of sleep, but even in sleep, it feels like it is working, holding the city's resources and schedules and stories in place. And you realize something quiet. If some Sumerian tablets are records of memory, not myth, then the temple's economic records are not separate from the sacred texts. They are adjacent layers of the same cultural mind. One layer counts. One layer comforts. Both preserve the shape of survival. You leave the complex slowly, and the night air feels cooler on your skin. The stars are still above you. The city is still breathing. Somewhere behind you, a scribe's last wedge mark settles into clay and becomes tomorrow's certainty. You leave the temple complex, and the city feels wider again, less controlled, more exposed to the night. The sky is a dark bowl overhead, and the streets carry a softer sound now, the kind of quiet that makes every small noise feel important. Somewhere a dog barks once and then decides it has made its point. Somewhere a door closes. Somewhere a tired voice calls a name and then stops as if even speech needs rest. And now with all that you have seen, you can finally let yourself face the part of these stories that is hardest to talk about without turning it into spectacle. Survival. Not heroic survival, not movie survival, but daily survival. The kind that feels like waking up and doing it again and again and again, even when your body would really prefer to retire permanently into a pile of reeds. Most historians agree that life in early urban centres could be physically demanding and precarious, shaped by hard labour, environmental stress disease, and the constant need to maintain infrastructure like canals and walls. That is solid ground. Even without making it graphic, you can acknowledge that living in a young city means living with risk. The city gives you protection and opportunity, but it also concentrates problems. Crowds mean sickness spreads. Irrigation brings fertility and also stagnant water. Power organises food and also demands labour. A careful reading might suggest that when myths describe monsters, curses or divine punishments, they may sometimes be translating real fears into symbolic form. This is not a claim that every monster equals one specific disease or one specific hazard. It is an interpretation myth can encode the emotional reality of danger. You walk along the edge of the city where the walls meet the open land. Outside is darkness, flat and unknown. Inside is brick and routine and rules. The wall is more than defence. It is a line between order and uncertainty. You run your hand along the rough surface and think about what it took to build it. Thousands of bricks, thousands of hours, thousands of hands. First light, joke, gentle. If you ever feel unmotivated, remember ancient people built entire city walls without forklifts, without podcasts, and without anyone saying, "Great job, team." Their motivational system was basically, "Please do not die." You keep walking and you notice a smell, not strong, just present. Smoke, cooking, sewage. The ordinary mix of dense living. You hear a cough from a doorway. You see a person sitting with their back against a wall, resting too long for comfort. You do not linger. You do not dramatize. You simply let the scene remind you that life is a body story as much as it is a myth story. Now you remember the monsters in the myths. The wild bull, the demon of disease, the restless forces of the desert. You can treat them as literary and religious beings. Yes, but you can also treat them as metaphors for what it felt like to face a world that could hurt you without explanation. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient peoples used symbolic language to express dangers that were otherwise difficult to control or predict. A monster is not only a creature, it is a name for fear. One interpretation is that when a community tells a monster story, it is practicing for survival. It is teaching boundaries. It is teaching caution. It is teaching that some spaces are dangerous, some behaviours are risky, some choices bring consequences. The story becomes a memory tool. Now the required scholarly debate phrase belongs here because the line between metaphor and literal belief is not clean. Historians still argue whether the frightening figures in Mesopotamian texts should be read primarily as literal objects of belief in a spirit-filled world, as symbolic expressions of social and natural threats, or as layered figures that function differently depending on genre, audience, and ritual setting. That debate matters because it keeps you honest. People can believe literally and also use symbols. A culture can treat demons as real and also use demon language to talk about illness. The ancient mind does not separate categories the way your modern mind likes to. Now you step into the workday again. You picture canal maintenance. This is not dramatic, but it is everything. Workers dig silt. They reinforce banks. They patch leaks. They move water from one place to another like they are negotiating with the living animal. Archaeology suggests that irrigation and canal systems required constant labour and organisation, and that failure could mean hunger. That's mainstream and safe. And this is where myth can become memory again, because when you live with constant maintenance, you begin to see the world as something that requires constant appeasement. You cannot ignore the river. You cannot ignore the canal. You cannot ignore the balance. So the gods become the language of maintenance. Offerings become social maintenance. Rituals become mental maintenance. The whole city becomes a machine that must be kept in tune. Second light joke, sleepy ancient life is basically maintenance mode forever. Your modern phone has updates. Uruk has canal silt. Same energy. Now you think about the word curse. In myths, curses sound dramatic. In real life, a curse can look like a bad season, a sick child, a broken tool, a failed harvest, a flood. A sequence of misfortunes that makes you feel targeted, even if nature is simply being nature. It is human to personalize suffering. It is human to ask, why me? So a story answers. A story says the gods were displeased. A story says a taboo was broken. A story says order must be restored. That answer may not satisfy a modern scientific mind, but it satisfies the emotional mind that needs a reason in order to keep going. And that is why the story persists. It becomes the community's way of remembering hardship without being crushed by it. Now we bring in a quirky tidbit, something that feels almost like gallows humour, but without gore. People in many times and places used odd protective measures, amulets, rituals and everyday superstitions to ward off illness and bad luck. In Mesopotamia, protective practices and incantations existed as part of the cultural toolbox. This is widely discussed in broad terms as part of ancient belief systems. The point is not to ridicule. The point is to see the human instinct. When you cannot control the world, you create small actions that make you feel less helpless. Third light joke. Gentle, it is like knocking on wood. Except instead of wood, you're knocking on a mud brick wall and hoping the universe respects your effort. Now, because survival themes attract fringe claims, we handle one safely. A fringe idea proposes that myths about monsters preserve memory of literal extinct creatures or advanced predators as if the texts are zoological reports. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have points more strongly toward symbolic and religious storytelling rather than straightforward natural history. Still, the fringe idea persists because it feels thrilling, and because humans love the thought that myth is a disguised documentary. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more useful insight is that myth can preserve something real without preserving it literally. It can preserve the experience of fear. It can preserve the sense of danger at the edge of town. It can preserve the memory that the world is not safe by default. Now, the cinematic what if for this section settles into a single quiet image. What if every time a Sumerian story speaks of a monster, it is also speaking of survival? Not survival as a headline, but survival as a routine. The monster is the river when it rises wrong. The monster is illness in a crowded city. The monster is hunger when the granary is low. The monster is the desert beyond the wall. The monster is the uncertainty of tomorrow. And the hero, whether king or ordinary person, is not only fighting an external beast, they are fighting the feeling that life is fragile. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it fits how humans tell stories when they are tired and scared and still have to wake up tomorrow. You stand again at the wall, looking out into the dark land beyond. The stars are steady. The city behind you is quiet but alive. Somewhere a temple lamp burns. Somewhere a worker sleeps, muscles aching. Somewhere a scribe's tablet dries, recording rations, recording offerings, recording the city's attempt to keep itself intact. And in that quiet, you understand why memory becomes myth, because memory needs a form strong enough to carry survival. A list carries numbers, a hymn carries emotion, a monster carries fear, a god carries meaning, and a tablet carries all of it pressed into clay, waiting for someone like you to listen gently, without demanding certainty, without mocking belief, without turning the past into a circus. Just listening, just remembering. The city has grown so quiet now that you can almost hear your own breathing inside your room here in the present, and you realise how strangely close you feel to people who lived so long ago. Not because you have solved their mysteries, and not because you have proven any single interpretation, but because you have listened long enough for the past to feel like a place with bodies, schedules, fears, jokes, and tired evenings. You return in your mind to the archive for the last time. The lamplight is steady. The shelves are still. The tablets sit in their quiet stacks like they are sleeping. And for a moment you just stand there, letting the weight of that fact settle gently in your chest. Clay remembers. Not perfectly, not completely, but persistently. Most historians agree that these tablets preserve a wide range of texts, from administrative records to hymns to myths, and that they offer one of our richest windows into early urban civilization. That is the solid ground beneath everything we did tonight. This is not fantasy. These are real objects that survived long enough to meet your eyes, your imagination, your midnight curiosity. And yet the deeper question remains open because it has to remain open. What if Sumerian tablets were records of memory, not myth? We have walked around that idea from many angles, and now at the end, you can hold it in a calmer way. One interpretation is that myth and memory are not opposites, they are neighbours. Sometimes myth is memory made ceremonial so it can be shared without breaking people's hearts. Sometimes memory is myth made practical so it can be stored without changing shape too fast. Sometimes a story is a rationalist's emotional twin. Sometimes a hymn is a city's nervous system humming out loud. And the tablets contain all of it. You think about the scribal school. the aching hands, the repetitive chant of signs. You think about Uruk's streets, the donkey complaints, the steady movement of goods and people. You think about the king list, the long reigns that might be symbolism, ideology, or a way of marking deep time. You think about flood stories that could be scrapbooks of many floods pressed into one shared narrative. You think about gods as names for forces and institutions, and about hymns as memory practices that teach a city what to feel. You think about ordinary tablets listing barley and beer, and how those lists preserve a truth no epic can replace. People were fed, people worked, people belonged to systems, people worried, people hoped. And then you think about uncertainty, the missing wedges, the translation choices, the scholarly debates, the fact that we cannot fully reconstruct the original sound of a hymn or the original intent behind a number. Historians still argue whether many of these texts should be read primarily as literal accounts, symbolic literature, political theology, or cultural memory, and how those functions shifted across time and context. That debate is not a problem. It is part of the beauty, because it means the tablets are still alive in a way, still generating thought, still inviting humility, still refusing to be reduced to a single slogan. First, light, joke, gentle. If the tablets could talk, they would probably say, "Please stop trying to turn me into one neat answer. I am literally thousands of tiny wedges. Complexity is my brand." Now you bring in the last quirky tidbit of the night, small but comforting. Clay tablets survive because they were durable, but also because people kept them in places designed to store them, and because they were sometimes baked or preserved by accident in destruction events. In other words, survival can be intentional and accidental at once, like memory itself. You remember some things on purpose, and some things stick because they happen too. Second light, joke, sleepy. The ancient world did not have cloud storage, but it had oops. The building burned and baked the archive, which is a terrible event and also awkwardly a preservation method. History is weird like that. Now, because we kept this honest, we also keep this safe. We do not claim the fringe ideas are confirmed. We do not pretend the tablets prove cosmic secrets. We do not say this is the truth. We say some people interpret, some scholars debate, some theories are fringe, and the most responsible thing you can do is enjoy the wonder without turning wonder into certainty. So here is the final cinematic what if softened quiet. What if the tablets are not telling you believe this? What if they are telling you remember this? Remember that rivers rise. Remember that cities are fragile. Remember that order takes work. Remember that people needed stories to survive. Remember that they sang to calm themselves. Remember that they counted barley because hunger is real. Remember that they wrote names because a name is a form of care. Remember that they looked at the sky and tried to make tomorrow less sharp. If you hold the tablets that way, then myth becomes less like a lie and more like a language of human endurance. A language that says we were here, we were small, we were afraid, we were clever, we built systems, we built songs, we built a way to speak through clay so the future could hear us. And the future did. You did. Now before we close, we slow everything down because the night is deep and your mind is ready to loosen its grip. 300-word wind down. The lamplight in the archive seems warmer now. as if it has decided to stop asking questions and simply sit with you. The tablets rest in their quiet stacks, each one a small weight of earth that once held wet fingerprints, once held fresh sound, once held a living moment that refused to vanish completely. You can imagine the soft hush of the room, the dust floating slowly, the steady patience of clay that does not hurry, does not argue, does not demand that you understand everything tonight. Outside, the ancient city fades into darkness. The canals are still. The walls stand silent. A distant hymn becomes only a memory of rhythm, like a heartbeat heard through a door. And in your own room, in your own time, you can feel that same rhythm settling behind your ribs, the gentle proof that you are safe, that you are here, that the night is allowed to be quiet. You do not need to solve the tablets to let them comfort you. You can let them be what they have always been, small anchors dropped into the river of time, a way for humans to hold on to meaning, to hold on to each other, to hold on to the fragile idea that life can be recorded, even if only in wedges pressed into clay. So let your eyes grow heavier. Let the sky outside your window become softer. Let the past drift back to its shelves, still and calm, while your thoughts drift to loosening like reeds in a slow current. And if one last image stays with you, let it be simple. A hand, a stylus, a quiet lamp, and the patient earth receiving a story not to prove anything but to remember.